The sharp clatter of heavy metal hitting polished marble echoed through the dining room, silencing the chatter of 20 wealthy guests. I looked down at the dented silver dog bowl sliding across the table toward me, inside it a pile of dry brown pellets. My son Kendrick stood over me, adjusting his expensive tailored suit with a smirk on his face. "Here is your portion, Dad," he announced, his voice projecting clearly so his business partners could hear. "It is organic kibble, and it probably costs more than those cheap dinners you used to make us growing up." Laughter erupted around the room. I just looked at him, wiped my mouth with a linen napkin, and stood up. "I am Leroy, 75 years old today, and this is the story of the night my own flesh and blood thought he had finally broken me. He thought I was just a penniless old man living in his basement. What he did not know was that I owned the ground he was standing on. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful person a lesson they will never forget. The evening was supposed to be a celebration of my 70th birthday. At least that is what Kendrick told me when he asked me to come upstairs from the basement apartment where I had been staying for the past 3 years. I put on my best suit, an old but impeccably pressed navy blue two-piece I had bought 20 years ago. I wanted to look dignified. I wanted to honor the memory of my late wife Vivian, who always loved seeing me dressed up. But when I walked into the grand foyer of the $1.5 million mansion, I realized the party was not for me at all. Kendrick and his wife Khloe had turned my birthday into a networking event. The house was filled with 20 upper-class business associates, all sipping expensive champagne and picking at miniature appetizers. I was the only black man in the room besides my son, and I was quickly ushered into a dark corner of the dining room far away from the important conversations. I sat there watching the son I raised from a boy into a man play the role of a wealthy, successful executive. Kendrick was 42 years old, heavily in debt, but obsessed with presenting an image of flawless luxury. He drove European sports cars he could not afford and wore watches that cost more than a reliable truck. I grew up in the segregated South and built a commercial heating and cooling empire from nothing but calloused hands and sheer willpower. I worked 18-hour days crawling through dusty vents and freezing ductwork so Kendrick would never have to know the sting of poverty. I paid for his college. I paid for his first car. And when he begged me, I silently co-signed the massive mortgage on this very house because his credit was an absolute joke. I never bragged about my money. I lived simply because Vivian and I knew the value of a hard-earned dollar. Because I never showed off my wealth, my son assumed it had dried up long ago. He assumed the $2,000 a month I handed him was my meager Social Security check, when in reality it was just pocket change from a massive trust fund I had established decades ago. As I sat quietly in the shadows observing the glittering crowd, Khloe made her grand entrance. Khloe was 38 years old, the proud owner of a luxury pet spa downtown, and she wore her privilege like a weapon. She walked into the dining room carrying her pristine white poodle in one arm and holding a glass of wine in the other. She navigated through the guests, soaking up their compliments before her eyes landed on me. The smile on her face was tight and cold. She had a habit of delivering the most vicious insults wrapped in a tone of polite concern. She stopped in front of my table, the poodle yapping softly. "Oh, Leroy," she sighed loudly enough for the nearest guests to turn their heads. "We are so glad you could crawl out of the basement tonight. It is good for you to get some fresh air." I offered a polite nod, keeping my calloused hands folded in my lap. "I learned a long time ago that you do not react to a dog barking behind a fence." But Khloe was not finished. She petted her dog and looked around at her friends. "You know, it is funny," she continued, her voice carrying over the ambient music. "Little Bella here has her own social media account. Brands actually pay us to post pictures of her. She earns her own keep. It is a shame we cannot say the same for everyone in this house." She looked down at me, her eyes filled with arrogant pity. "At least the dog contributes. You just drain our retirement fund hiding down there in the dark." A few of the guests chuckled awkwardly. Others openly smirked, whispering to each other, covering their mouths. The microaggressions were not new to me. For 3 years I had endured her subtle jabs about my worn-out work boots, my simple meals, the way I spoke. She despised my working-class roots and constantly tried to distance herself and Kendrick from the reality of where our family came from. But doing it publicly on my 70th birthday in front of a room full of strangers was a new low even for her. That was when Kendrick walked over holding the silver dog bowl. He placed it right in front of me, the dry kibble rattling against the metal. The room fell completely silent. All 20 pairs of eyes shifted to the old black man sitting in the corner staring at a bowl of dog food. Kendrick laughed a cruel, hollow sound that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. "Here is your portion, Dad. Organic kibble. Costs more than the dinners you used to make us. This is what freeloaders eat, old man." The guests burst into laughter. They laughed at my expense, believing the narrative my son had sold them. The narrative of the successful, wealthy son burdened by a useless, broke father who contributed nothing to society. Kendrick stood there with his chest puffed out, waiting for a reaction. He wanted me to yell. He wanted me to throw the bowl across the room. He wanted to prove to his friends that I was exactly what Khloe claimed I was, an ungrateful, unstable burden who lacked basic manners. But I did not give them the satisfaction of my anger. Decades of dealing with ruthless contractors, discriminatory bankers, and cutthroat businessmen had taught me the ultimate power of absolute silence. I looked at the bowl of dog food. Then I looked up at the man I had sacrificed my youth to raise. I saw the weakness in his eyes masked by expensive fabric and cheap arrogance. I saw a boy who had lost his way and a man who had sold his soul for the approval of people who would abandon him the second his bank account ran dry. I reached for the linen napkin beside my plate. I slowly wiped my mouth, folded the napkin perfectly in half, and placed it neatly next to the dog food. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a soft scrape against the hardwood floor. The laughter in the room began to die down, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable silence. I looked directly into Kendrick's eyes, and with a calm, steady voice, I simply said, "Thank you for the meal, son." I turned my back on the whispering and the glittering facade of their fabricated life. I walked slowly and deliberately out of the dining room and down the long hallway toward the basement door. I did not rush. I did not look back. I descended the wooden stairs into the cool, quiet darkness of my living quarters. When I closed the door behind me, I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble with sorrow. I simply walked over to the small, iron-framed bed I slept on and reached underneath it. I pulled out a heavy, battered leather briefcase that had traveled with me for 40 years. The combination lock clicked open with a satisfying snap. Inside, there were no old clothes or worthless sentimental trinkets. Inside were stacks of certified property deeds, offshore bank statements, and the master documents for V&L Holdings. I looked at the commercial lease agreement bearing Khloe's signature for her luxury pet spa and the mortgage papers bearing Kendrick's signature for the mansion upstairs. They thought I was a freeloader. They thought they owned the world. They were about to find out that I owned them. The grandfather clock in the hallway upstairs chimed 2 times. It was 2 in the morning and the massive $1.5 million mansion was finally quiet. The wealthy guests had long since driven away in their luxury sedans, leaving behind the lingering smell of expensive wine and cheap arrogance. Down in the basement, the air was cool and still. I sat on the edge of my small, iron-framed bed looking at the silver dog bowl that I had brought down with me. I did not bring it down out of shame. I brought it down as a reminder. I placed it gently into the trash can. Then I turned my attention to the heavy leather briefcase resting on my mattress. I did not pack clothes. I did not pack a toothbrush or the small trinkets Vivian and I had collected over the years. I only packed the paper trail of my son's illusions. I zipped up my jacket, grabbed my phone, and ordered a private car. The application told me the driver would arrive in 10 minutes. I walked up the wooden stairs for the very last time. My footsteps were silent, a habit you learn when you spend your life trying not to disturb the peace of people who think they are better than you. The main floor was a mess of half-empty champagne flutes and discarded napkins. I walked into the massive gourmet kitchen with its imported Italian marble countertops and custom cabinetry. Kendrick always bragged about this kitchen to his friends. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key to the front door. I placed it right in the center of the kitchen island. Next to it, I placed a bright yellow sticky note. I took a pen and wrote 4 simple words. No more freeloading. I did not add my name. I did not add a goodbye. I walked out the front door and let it lock behind me. The night air was crisp. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness of the exclusive gated community. I climbed into the back seat, resting my briefcase on my lap. The driver, a young man with tired eyes, nodded at me in the rearview mirror and drove away. As we navigated through the quiet streets, my mind drifted back to a time before these sprawling lawns and gated mansions existed for people who looked like me. I thought about the 1960s. I thought about the blistering heat of the southern summers and the freezing drafts of unfinished commercial buildings. I built Marcus & Sons heating and cooling from absolute nothing. Back then, banks would not even look at a young black man asking for a business loan. I had to work 3 jobs just to buy my first second-hand service truck. Vivian and I lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment, saving every single penny eating beans and rice so I could buy tools and equipment. For decades, I crawled through asbestos-filled attics and hauled massive compressors up narrow flights of stairs until my hands bled and my knees gave out. I built a commercial empire that spanned 3 states. I secured contracts with hospitals, corporate high-rises, and government buildings. When Vivian passed away, I quietly liquidated the operational side of the business and rolled the massive profits into V&L Holdings. I became a ghost in the financial world, silently accumulating wealth and commercial property. And what did Kendrick do with that legacy? He bought tailored suits and leased European sports cars. He looked at the $1.5 million mansion we just left and genuinely believed he bought it with his own sweat. He walked around hosting parties, playing the role of a self-made millionaire. But the truth was hidden in the very briefcase resting on my knees. Kendrick could not even secure a standard car loan with his abysmal credit score. 3 years ago, when he begged me crying about how he needed this house to project an image of success for his consulting firm, I stepped in. I did not just give him a down payment. I am the silent co-signer on the mortgage and the majority equity holder of the property. Legally speaking, that house is mine. Kendrick is just a tenant who thinks he is a king. The sedan pulled up to the entrance of a grand 4-star hotel in the heart of downtown. The glowing lights of the city reflected off the polished glass doors. I thanked the driver, handed him a generous cash tip, and stepped out into the night. The lobby was quiet, but impeccably dressed staff stood ready behind the mahogany front desk. I walked up to the receptionist, an elegant woman who looked at my simple jacket and battered briefcase with a brief flicker of hesitation. She welcomed me politely but cautiously, and asked if I had a reservation tonight. I shook my head and pulled my wallet from my inside pocket. I told her I needed a suite, the executive suite on the top floor, if it was available, and that I would be staying indefinitely. She typed rapidly on her keyboard. She informed me that the executive suite was quite expensive and required a substantial deposit. I did not argue. I simply slid a heavy, solid metal credit card across the counter. It was not a standard bank card. It was an exclusive tier card reserved for high-net-worth clients. The moment she saw it, her entire posture changed. The slight hesitation vanished, replaced by absolute deference. She processed the card with practiced efficiency and assured me my stay would be perfectly comfortable. I took my key card and rode the glass elevator up to the top floor. The suite was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering skyline. It was luxurious, quiet, and entirely mine. But I was not there to sleep. I walked over to the large mahogany desk in the corner, turned on the desk lamp, and opened my briefcase. I spread the documents out across the smooth surface of the desk. For 3 years, I had played the role of the silent safety net. I had let my son and his prejudiced wife believe I was a burden, while I secretly kept their sinking ship afloat. Now it was time to look at the exact cost of my blind parental love. I pulled out the banking statements for the joint accounts and the automatic drafts I had set up. The numbers stared back at me, stark and unforgiving. Every single month without fail, an automatic transfer of $8,000 left my trust account and went directly to cover the gap in Kendrick's mortgage payments. He barely made enough to cover the property taxes and utilities, but he paraded around throwing dinner parties as if he were a titan of industry. Then there was Khloe. I looked at the statement for a secondary credit card I had opened for emergencies when they claimed they were struggling to pay for groceries. The statement showed charges from Prada, Gucci, and high-end pet boutiques. She was spending upwards of $4,000 a month on designer bags and organic treats for her poodle using my money, while simultaneously mocking me for eating her organic dog food. I sat there in the quiet hotel room, tracing the lines of the financial documents with my calloused finger. Over the past 36 months, I had silently subsidized their fake luxury lifestyle to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. And my reward was public humiliation on my 70th birthday. My reward was being called a freeloader by a woman whose entire existence was funded by my hard work. A cold, focused anger settled deep into my bones. I felt a profound clarity. I was done being the silent victim. I was done financing the disrespect of my own blood. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I looked at the time. It was nearing 3 in the morning. Most people would be deep in sleep, but I knew Ruben would answer. Ruben was a sharp-witted, lifelong Latino lawyer who had been by my side since the 1980s. We had fought brutal contract disputes together. We had navigated the treacherous waters of commercial real estate when nobody wanted to see 2 minority men succeed. We were more than lawyer and client. We were brothers in arms. I dialed his personal number. It rang twice before he picked up. His voice was gravelly with sleep, but instantly alert. He said my name and noted the time, asking me to tell him I was not in the hospital. I told him I was in a suite at the downtown plaza looking out over the city. My voice was completely steady. I heard the rustle of sheets as he sat up. He asked what was going on, reminding me that I only called him at this hour when someone had made a very big mistake. I stared at the reflection of the city lights in the glass window and told him a mistake was indeed made. I explained that I had let a parasite live in my house for too long, and tonight it decided to bite me in front of an audience. Ruben went completely silent on the other end of the line. He knew exactly what I was talking about. He had warned me for years about Kendrick's reckless spending and Khloe's toxic attitude. I could almost hear him nodding in the dark. He asked me what I needed him to do, his tone shifting into full professional mode, ready for war. I gathered the bank statements into a neat pile and closed the leather briefcase with a solid snap. I let the cold reality of my decisions sink in. I told Ruben it was time to cut the cord, all of them. The morning sun broke through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hotel suite, casting a warm golden glow across the mahogany floors. For the first time in 3 years, I woke up to absolute silence. There was no barking poodle. There were no hushed arguments coming from the floor above me. There was no heavy feeling of dread sitting on my chest. I ordered a simple breakfast of black coffee and toast from room service. I sat at the glass dining table overlooking the waking city and finally breathed. My cell phone sat on the marble counter a few feet away. It had been vibrating constantly since I woke up. The screen lit up with notification after notification. Kendrick and Khloe had finally realized the well had run dry. The bank had rejected their auto draft for the massive mortgage. Khloe's black card had been swallowed by the machine at some high-end boutique. I did not pick up the phone. I simply let it buzz. By mid-afternoon, the panic on their end had mutated into something entirely different. People who build their entire identities around fake wealth do not handle poverty with grace. They do not look inward and reflect on their mistakes. They look for someone to blame. I knew my son well enough to know he would not accept responsibility for his financial ruin. He would rather burn down his own life than admit to his wealthy friends that he was living on his father's dime. And Khloe was even worse. She was a woman who used her tears as currency and her privilege as a weapon. I expected them to be angry. I expected them to threaten me. What I did not expect was the sheer sinister depth of the campaign they were about to launch against me. A gentle knock on my hotel room door broke my concentration. It was Ruben. He walked in carrying his leather briefcase and a sleek silver tablet. He looked serious. Ruben had been practicing law long enough to know how ugly family disputes could get, but even he seemed disturbed by what he had to show me. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the silver pot on my table and sat across from me. He told me that when the money stopped, Kendrick and Khloe did not go to the bank to figure out a payment plan. They went on the offensive. Ruben explained that he knew they would try something desperate, so he had hired a private investigator to keep an eye on them. The investigator was a young, quiet man who knew how to blend into any environment. What this young man captured on camera earlier that morning was a level of betrayal I had not anticipated. Ruben unlocked the tablet and slid it across the glass table toward me. He told me I needed to prepare myself for what I was about to see. I pressed the play button on the screen. The video was shot from across a familiar street. I immediately recognized the red brick storefronts and the faded painted signs. It was the South Side. It was the predominantly black, working-class neighborhood where I had started Marcus & Sons Heating and Cooling all those decades ago. It was the neighborhood where Vivian and I bought our first groceries. It was the place where the community knew me not as a wealthy, silent investor, but as Leroy, the hard-working man who always fixed the church air conditioning for free. The video showed Khloe's pristine white luxury sport utility vehicle pulling up to the curb right in front of Henderson's barbershop. It was a place where the older men in the community gathered to play chess and talk about the old days. Khloe stepped out of her expensive car wearing a beige designer trench coat and oversized sunglasses. She looked completely out of place. She looked like a wealthy tourist who had taken a wrong turn into a neighborhood she would normally lock her doors to drive through. But today, she was on a mission. She walked right up to the group of older black men sitting on the folding chairs outside the barbershop. I recognized Marcus, the private investigator, sitting a few feet away pretending to read a newspaper while his hidden camera recorded every single word. The audio was crisp and clear. I watched as Khloe took off her sunglasses and put on the most sickeningly sweet, fragile performance I had ever witnessed. She introduced herself as Kendrick's wife. The men nodded politely, recognizing my son's name. Then the tears started. Khloe covered her mouth with her manicured hand and began to sob. She told Mr. Henderson that she was desperately looking for me. She told him that the family was terrified and that they did not know where I had gone. Mr. Henderson looked concerned and asked if I was missing. Khloe nodded her head and leaned in closer to the men. She lowered her voice, putting on a tone of deep, tragic pity. She told my oldest friends that I was very sick. She used the word dementia. She told them that my mind had been slipping for months and that Kendrick and I had been hiding it out of pride. She said I had been wandering the house at night confused and aggressive. She painted a picture of a helpless, crazy old man who could no longer be trusted to care for himself. But she did not stop there. The true venom of her visit was yet to come. She wiped a fake tear from her cheek and told them that in my confused state, I had somehow gained access to Kendrick's business accounts. She lied straight to their faces. She told them that I had emptied my son's life savings and run away. She claimed Kendrick was heartbroken because he had worked so hard to build his company, and now his sick father had stolen everything he had. She said they just wanted to find me and put me in a safe, secure medical facility where I could not hurt myself or anyone else. She begged the men to call her immediately if they saw me wandering the streets. She handed them her expensive embossed business cards and walked back to her luxury vehicle, playing the role of the devoted white savior, trying to rescue her poor, sick black father-in-law from his own decaying mind. I sat in the hotel suite staring at the black screen of the tablet long after the video ended. The silence in the room was heavy. Ruben watched my face, waiting for a reaction. My hands were perfectly still, resting on the glass table. I felt a cold, slow-burning fire spreading through my chest. Khloe was not just lying. She was weaponizing my race and my age against me in my own community. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew how society viewed older black men. She knew that if she planted the seed of dementia and aggression, people would stop listening to me. She was laying the groundwork to completely strip me of my credibility and my humanity. She wanted to make sure that when I finally spoke up, nobody would believe me. They would just see a crazy old man who stole from his successful son. She was building a narrative to justify locking me in a state-run facility so she and Kendrick could seize control of my estate. It was a smear campaign designed to destroy my reputation before I even had a chance to defend myself. They thought they were being brilliant. They thought I was sitting somewhere scared and confused, hiding from the mess I had made. They thought I was just a tired old HVAC worker who did not understand how the world of legalities and public relations worked. They had no idea that I had spent 40 years sitting at negotiation tables with men far more dangerous and far smarter than them. Ruben leaned back in his chair and took a sip of his coffee. He told me that they were establishing a paper trail of concern. He explained that by telling the community I was sick and dangerous, they were preparing to go to a judge. They were going to use these visits as proof that they were loving family members desperately trying to save me. Ruben warned me that if they found a corrupt doctor willing to sign a false medical evaluation, they could file for an emergency conservatorship. They could legally freeze my accounts and force me into a ward before I could even hire an attorney to fight back. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below. I thought about Vivian. I thought about how hard we had worked to build a life of dignity and respect. I thought about all the sacrifices we had made to ensure Kendrick would never have to struggle. And this was how he repaid us. He let his wife go down to the neighborhood I helped build and portray me as a rabid thief who was losing his mind. He was willing to strip away every ounce of my dignity just to keep his hands on my money. He was willing to bury me alive. I turned my gaze away from the window and looked back at Ruben. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or break things. The anger I felt was far too deep for loud noises. I reached out and tapped the dark screen of the tablet. I felt a chilling smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile a man gets when he realizes he no longer has to hold back. I looked at my lawyer and told him that if Khloe wanted me to be crazy, I was more than happy to oblige her. I told Ruben that we were not going to stop at cutting off their credit cards. We were going to let them dig their own graves. I told him to let them file the paperwork. I told him to let them bring their corrupt doctors and their fake tears to the courthouse. I wanted them to feel entirely victorious right up until the moment I dropped the sky on their heads. I looked at Ruben and said, "She wants me to be crazy, so let us see how crazy I can get." When a man who has never earned a real dollar in his life suddenly loses his safety net, he does not learn how to swim. He learns how to steal. For 42 years, my son Kendrick had a soft cushion to land on every single time he made a mistake. I was that cushion. I was the silent force absorbing the impact of his failures. Now that I had pulled the funding, he was in a free fall, and the ground was approaching fast. I sat in my hotel suite sipping my black coffee and watching the busy city streets far below my window. Ruben, my lawyer, had warned me that financial withdrawal causes severe side effects in people addicted to a fake lifestyle. Kendrick had a massive mortgage payment due, he had luxury car leases to maintain, he had expensive country club membership fees, and his wife Khloe had maxed out every line of credit she could get her hands on to fund her pet spa and her designer wardrobe. They were drowning in a sea of their own arrogance. I knew exactly what Kendrick would try to do next. When you cut off a parasite's food supply, it desperately looks for another vein to tap. I had prepared for this exact scenario. Back in 1980, I bought a comprehensive whole life insurance policy. I was just starting my commercial heating and cooling business, and I wanted to make sure that if I fell off a roof or got crushed by a compressor, my wife Vivian and my young son would never have to worry about paying the rent. I paid the premiums on that policy every single month for 40 years. When Vivian passed away, the policy remained untouched, quietly accumulating a massive cash value. It was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Kendrick knew about this policy. He had seen the annual statements arrive in the mail. I knew he would try to drain it. What my son did not know was that Ruben and I had spent the entire morning placing a titanium-level security freeze on my complete financial portfolio. No transfers could be made. No withdrawals could be authorized. No loans against the equity could be approved. Absolutely nothing could move without my physical presence, my government-issued identification, and my biometric thumbprint. The vault was entirely locked, but Kendrick was about to try and pick the lock anyway. Marcus, the private investigator that Ruben hired, had been tailing my son since dawn. He sent me secure messages updating me on every single move Kendrick made. Around 1 in the afternoon, Kendrick drove his leased European sports car to the main branch of my bank in the wealthy downtown financial district. Marcus followed him inside, pretending to fill out deposit slips at a nearby kiosk. Marcus noted that Kendrick looked terrible. His usually immaculate tailored suit was deeply wrinkled as if he had slept in it. He was sweating profusely despite the heavy air conditioning in the expansive bank lobby. He looked like a man running out of oxygen. He walked directly up to the senior loan officer and requested a private meeting. Kendrick handed over a thick stack of paperwork. He was applying for a $50,000 cash advance loan against the accumulated cash value of my life insurance policy. $50,000 was just enough to cover his immediate debts, pay off Khloe's maxed-out credit cards, and stop the bank foreclosure notices for 1 more month. The loan officer took the paperwork and began typing the information into his computer terminal. At the bottom of those legal documents was my signature. It was a signature Kendrick had practiced and forged. My own son was willing to commit a serious federal crime just to keep up appearances. He was willing to steal from his elderly father to maintain the illusion of wealth for his prejudiced wife and his country club friends. The bank system reaction was immediate and beautiful. The moment the loan officer entered my social security number and the forged signature document was scanned, the bank's internal security system locked down completely. A bright red fraud alert flashed across the monitors in the branch. The security freeze Ruben put in place was absolute and unforgiving. The loan officer stopped typing. He looked at Kendrick with a completely blank expression, excused himself politely, and walked into the secure back office. Kendrick sat there tapping his expensive leather shoes against the polished marble floor. He wiped the sweat from his forehead completely, unaware that the trap had just snapped shut around his ankle. 10 minutes later, the branch manager walked out of the back office. But he was not alone. He was flanked by 2 large armed security guards. The manager approached the desk and informed Kendrick that the account was permanently frozen due to suspected elder financial abuse and identity theft. He told my son that the signature on the loan application did not match the biometric security protocols I had established with the bank just days prior. He informed Kendrick that the transaction had been officially flagged as fraudulent and that the documents were being confiscated as evidence. Kendrick panicked. His facade of the wealthy, calm executive shattered completely. He started raising his voice in the middle of the quiet bank lobby. He demanded the money, claiming he had legal power of attorney over my estate. He played the role of the outraged businessman insulted by the accusation. He yelled that his father was sick and that he needed the funds for my medical care. He tried to use the exact same lies Khloe had peddled in my old neighborhood. But the bank manager was not moved by his theatrical performance. Bank managers deal with numbers, and the numbers clearly stated that Kendrick was committing a felony. The manager politely but firmly asked Kendrick to leave the premises immediately before the local police were called to investigate the forged documents. Marcus watched closely as my son, the man who loved to boast about his elite status and mock my working-class roots, was escorted out of the bank by armed security guards. He was marched past dozens of wealthy customers who stared at him with judgment and pity. It was a brutal public humiliation. He walked out into the glaring afternoon sun with nothing but a rejected application and the looming, terrifying threat of a federal fraud investigation hanging over his head. His plan had failed spectacularly. Kendrick was completely out of time. Traditional banks had slammed their heavy vault doors in his face. His credit was destroyed. The luxury life he had built on a foundation of my hard work was collapsing around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. But a man drowning in his own debt does not stop thrashing. If he could not get the money legally through a bank, he would go somewhere else to find it. Marcus continued to follow him as Kendrick drove his flashy car away from the safe, wealthy downtown district and headed toward the industrial abandoned outskirts of the city. I was sitting in my quiet hotel room eating a simple lunch when my phone vibrated on the table. Marcus had sent me a series of high-resolution photographs from his surveillance camera. I opened the files on my screen and zoomed in closely. The images showed a bleak setting. Kendrick had parked his expensive sports car behind a dilapidated warehouse in a very dangerous part of town. The area was surrounded by broken chain-link fences and overgrown weeds. Kendrick was standing in the middle of an empty parking lot talking to a large man leaning against a beat-up black sedan. I recognized the type of man immediately. I had seen men like him operating in my old neighborhood decades ago. The man was a known local loan shark. He was a ruthless predator who preyed on desperate people who had burned every other bridge in their lives. He wore a heavy leather jacket and had a cold, calculating posture. Kendrick was taking out a street loan. He was borrowing money from dangerous criminals who do not send polite collection letters in the mail when you miss a payment. They send enforcers to your front door to break your legs. My son had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had stepped out of the safe, comfortable world I had built for him and walked directly into the violent criminal underworld. He was risking his own safety and his future for a few $1,000s in dirty cash. I looked at the photograph of my son shaking hands with a dangerous criminal, and I felt a cold, deep satisfaction mixed with a heavy paternal disappointment. I had given him everything he needed to succeed in life, and he threw it all away for arrogance and vanity. Kendrick was now in serious, dangerous debt. The financial walls were closing in on him, and the trap I had carefully laid was snapping shut perfectly around him. I sat across from Ruben in the quiet elegance of my hotel suite. The city below us was a chaotic maze of traffic and noise, but up here the air was completely still. I poured us both a cup of black coffee from the silver pot on the glass table. Ruben adjusted his glasses and opened his laptop. We had just watched the private investigator footage of my son securing a street loan from a dangerous criminal. But the financial bleeding was only one part of the infection. When you spend 40 years running commercial construction sites, you learn a fundamental truth about human nature. You never leave a job site unguarded. People will steal the copper wire right out of the walls if they think nobody is watching. My basement was no different. Before I zipped up my jacket and walked out of that mansion 3 nights ago, I did one last thing. I reached behind the dusty ventilation duct near the ceiling and attached a small motion-activated security camera. It was a tiny black lens blending perfectly into the shadows. I synced it to an application on my phone. I knew my son Kendrick and his wife Khloe would eventually come down to my living quarters. I knew that when the bank accounts froze and the credit cards declined, their desperation would drive them into the dark to scavenge. Ruben tapped the keyboard and brought up the encrypted video files. He looked at me with a heavy sigh and warned me that what I was about to see was going to be ugly. I nodded and told him to press play. I had already seen my son feed me dog food in front of 20 people. I was immune to ugly. The video feed buffered for a second before the basement came into sharp focus. The timestamp in the corner read 4 in the afternoon. The heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs flew open with a violent crash. Kendrick and Khloe marched down the steps. They did not look like the polished, wealthy executives they pretended to be at their dinner parties. They looked like panicked animals cornered in a trap. Kendrick had taken off his expensive suit jacket and his tie was loosened. Khloe was still wearing her designer clothes, but her hair was messy and her face was twisted in a frantic panic. They immediately began tearing my room apart. My son grabbed the thin mattress of my iron-framed bed and flipped it completely over, throwing my sheets onto the concrete floor. Khloe went straight for my old wooden dresser. She yanked the drawers out with so much force that they crashed to the ground, scattering my simple work shirts and socks everywhere. They were looking for cash. They assumed that because I lived like a poor man, I must have been hoarding stacks of $100 bills under my floorboards or hiding gold in my shoes. Kendrick dropped to his knees and started prying at the loose baseboards near the closet. He was sweating heavily, muttering curses under his breath. Khloe was ripping open old shoeboxes and throwing my personal letters across the room. It was a pathetic display of greed. This was the boy I had taught to walk. This was the boy I had worked 18-hour shifts to send to a private university. And here he was crawling on his hands and knees in the dirt, desperately trying to steal pennies from the old man he had just humiliated. Ruben paused the video and shook his head in absolute disgust. He muttered that they were acting like drug addicts looking for a fix. I told him that money was their drug and I had just cut off their supply. The video resumed. After 10 minutes of aggressive searching, they realized there was nothing hidden in the basement. I had not left a single dime, a single checkbook, or a single piece of valuable paper behind. The realization hit Khloe like a physical blow. She kicked my empty suitcase across the room and let out a piercing scream of frustration. She paced back and forth, her hands pulling at her hair. She turned to Kendrick and dropped the sweet, caring daughter-in-law act completely. Her voice was shrill and filled with pure, unfiltered malice. She yelled that they were going to lose the house and her luxury pet spa if they did not get their hands on my trust fund immediately. Kendrick sat on the edge of my overturned bed, wiping his face. He told her the bank would not let him touch the life insurance policy and that the accounts were frozen solid. Khloe stopped pacing and looked at him with eyes so cold they sent a shiver down my spine even through the computer screen. She pointed her finger at him and declared that they only had one option left. She said they had to get a conservatorship. She screamed the words with an absolute ruthless clarity. She told Kendrick they needed to find a doctor to declare me legally incompetent and senile. She laid out the entire evil plan right there in front of the hidden camera. She said they would use the fake diagnosis to strip me of all my civil rights. She said they would lock me in a miserable, underfunded state-run nursing home where I would be heavily medicated and unable to contact a lawyer. Once I was locked away in a ward, she said they would take over the trust fund, sell the properties, and take absolutely everything I had ever built. I sat back in my chair in the hotel suite and stared at the paused screen. A conservatorship. It is the most powerful and dangerous legal tool a family member can use against an elder in this country. Ruben let out a low whistle and rubbed his forehead. He explained to me that if a corrupt doctor signs off on a medical evaluation confirming severe dementia, a judge can grant emergency temporary guardianship within 48 hours. It happens more often than people realize. It is a legal kidnapping. The moment the judge signs the paper, your accounts are frozen entirely. You lose your right to make your own decisions. You lose your phone, your freedom, and your voice. The court-appointed guardian, the very person who petitioned against you, gains total control over every cent you own. It is a terrifying weapon, and Khloe was wielding it with absolute precision. She had just told Kendrick to use the law to steal my life. I looked back at the screen, waiting to hear my son defend me. I waited to hear the boy I had raised tell his wife that locking his father in an institution to steal his money was crossing a line he would never cross. I hoped against hope that Kendrick still had some small spark of humanity left in his soul. I thought about how his mother, Vivian, would weep if she could see the man her little boy had become. Ruben pressed play again. The tension in the basement on screen was suffocating. Khloe stood over Kendrick demanding an answer. She told him that if they did not get control of the money by Friday, the loan shark he met earlier today would come looking for the $50,000, and he would not be asking nicely. Kendrick stared at the concrete floor. The silence stretched out between them. He did not look at the photograph of his late mother sitting on my nightstand. He did not look at the calloused work boots I left by the door, the boots that had paid for the very roof over his head. He slowly lifted his head and met Khloe's eyes. He nodded his head slowly at first, and then with complete resolve. He agreed with her without a single ounce of hesitation. He told her she was right. He said they had to do it. Kendrick then reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. The video captured his face perfectly clearly under the harsh basement light. He looked at his wife and told her he knew a guy. He said he knew a disgraced doctor who was fired from the hospital down the street a few years back. Kendrick stated plainly that this doctor would write a completely fake psychological evaluation confirming advanced dementia and paranoia, and he told her it would only cost $5,000 in cash. The camera feed cut off as the motion-activated sensor stopped recording. Ruben closed his laptop and looked at me with wide eyes. We sat in the quiet of the hotel suite, the implications of what we just heard sinking into our bones. The stakes had just shifted from a simple financial cutoff to a fight for my actual freedom. Kendrick was not just a greedy son anymore. He was actively planning a criminal conspiracy to lock me away for the rest of my life. If he managed to secure that fake medical evaluation, he would march into court and use the legal system to erase my existence. I stood up from the glass table and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling city I had helped build. I thought about the thousands of hard-working men and women who get thrown into facilities every year by greedy relatives just like my son. I thought about how easy it is for society to ignore an older black man once someone pins a medical label on his chest. But Kendrick had made one fatal miscalculation. He thought he was dealing with a frail, uneducated old man who would just sit quietly and accept his fate. He forgot that I had spent my entire life fighting systems that were designed to keep me down. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, absolute determination. They were trying to build a cage for me, but they were about to realize they had locked themselves inside it instead. I turned to Ruben and told him to get the paperwork ready because we were going to war. The sunlight in my hotel suite felt entirely too bright for the dark reality of what my son was planning. Ruben and I sat in silence for a long time after the basement video ended. A father should never have to watch his own child conspire to lock him in a psychiatric ward. But I did not have the luxury of sorrow. Sorrow is a useless emotion when a predator is actively hunting you. And Kendrick was hunting me. He was desperate. He owed $50,000 to a violent street criminal and his entire fake empire was crumbling. When a man like Kendrick runs out of options, he does not surrender. He doubles down on his cruelty. My phone vibrated on the glass table. It was a secure message from Marcus, the private investigator Ruben had hired. Marcus was earning every single penny we paid him. He had been tailing my son since the disastrous encounter at the bank. The message contained a live tracking link and a brief text. It said Kendrick was pulling into the parking lot of a rundown 24-hour diner on the industrial edge of the city. It was the kind of place that smelled like stale grease and burnt coffee. It was not the sort of establishment my son would ever visit voluntarily. Kendrick only ate at restaurants where the waiters wore ties and the menus did not list the prices. If he was at a greasy spoon on the wrong side of the tracks, he was there to conduct dirty business. Marcus sent a steady stream of photographs directly to my phone. I watched the scene unfold in real time from the safety of my executive suite. The first picture showed Kendrick stepping out of his leased sports car. He looked exhausted. His shoulders were slumped and he kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected the loan shark to jump out from behind a dumpster. He walked into the diner and slid into a vinyl booth in the very back corner. 10 minutes later, a second man arrived. Marcus captured his face perfectly through the diner window. Ruben leaned over my shoulder and immediately recognized him. The man was Dr. Arthur Vance. He was a disgraced psychiatrist who had barely avoided losing his medical license a few years back due to an investigation involving prescription fraud. Dr. Vance looked exactly like a man willing to sell his soul. He wore a wrinkled suit jacket over a stained shirt. His hair was thinning and his face carried the bloated, exhausted look of someone who drank too much and slept too little. He slid into the booth across from my son. Marcus had anticipated the meeting. He was already sitting 2 booths away, hiding behind a laminated menu with a directional microphone pointed straight at their table. The audio feed came through my phone a few minutes later. The diner was noisy with the clattering of plates and the hum of the old refrigerator, but the conversation between my son and the corrupt doctor was chillingly clear. Kendrick did not waste time with pleasantries. His voice was tight with anxiety. He told Dr. Vance that he needed the paperwork immediately. He said the bank was threatening to foreclose on his mansion and he needed full legal authority over my estate by the end of the week. Dr. Vance let out a low, raspy laugh. He told Kendrick that expedited medical evaluations carried a premium price. He reminded my son that signing a certificate of mental incapacity without ever physically examining the patient was a massive legal risk. He said if he was going to put his medical license on the line, he needed to be compensated appropriately. I listened as my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and tie his shoes, reached into his designer coat. Marcus sent a photograph of the exact moment. Kendrick slid a thick brown manila envelope across the sticky table. It was $5,000 in cash. It was money he had likely scraped together by selling off whatever luxury watches or golf clubs he had left. Dr. Vance took the envelope, weighed it in his hand, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. In return, he slid a thin blue folder across the table toward Kendrick. The audio feed picked up the rustle of paper as Kendrick opened the folder. He asked the doctor what the official diagnosis was. Dr. Vance spoke with a terrifying casualness. He said he had written a comprehensive evaluation stating that I suffered from advanced Alzheimer's disease combined with violent paranoid delusions. He wrote that I was prone to wandering, that I was entirely incapable of managing my own finances, and that I posed a severe physical threat to myself and my family. He concluded the fake report by recommending immediate institutionalization in a secure state-run psychiatric facility. I sat in my hotel room and felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. Advanced Alzheimer's disease. Violent paranoia. These were not just medical terms, they were legal weapons. In the American justice system, a piece of paper signed by a licensed psychiatrist is treated like absolute truth. Once a judge saw that document, my 40 years of hard work, my commercial empire, my sharp mind, and my spotless reputation would mean absolutely nothing. I would cease to be Leroy, the successful business owner. I would become Leroy, the dangerous and senile old black man who needed to be locked away for his own good. Kendrick sounded relieved on the audio recording. He thanked the corrupt doctor and said this was exactly what he needed to get the emergency conservatorship approved. He said his lawyers would file the petition the very next morning. He actually laughed. He laughed as he held the document that would effectively end my life as a free man. He told Dr. Vance that once he gained control of the trust fund, he would send a nice bonus his way. The two men shook hands and walked out of the diner. Reuben closed his laptop and looked at me. His face was pale. He had seen a lot of terrible things in family court, but watching a son purchase his father's mental destruction for $5,000 was a new level of evil. Reuben told me that we needed to move faster than we had originally planned. If Kendrick's lawyers filed that fake evaluation in front of a sympathetic judge, they could get an emergency ex parte order. An ex parte order meant the judge could grant temporary guardianship without me even being present in the courtroom to defend myself. They could freeze my hotel room door card, cut off my bank access, and send an ambulance to haul me away before I even knew there was a hearing. I stood up and paced across the thick carpet of the hotel suite. I told Reuben that we were not going to let that happen. We had the audio recording of the bribe. We had the photographs of the cash exchange. We had the absolute truth on our side. I told him to contact the best neurologists in the city. I was going to undergo every single cognitive test available to prove my mind was sharper than ever. I was going to build an impenetrable fortress of medical evidence to crush Dr. Vance and his fake diagnosis. Reuben agreed and immediately started making phone calls to schedule the appointments. I walked over to the window and looked down at the street below. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The sadness of losing my son had completely burned away, leaving nothing but a hardened warrior preparing for battle. I was ready to destroy him in court. I was ready to strip away every illusion he had ever built. But the enemy was moving much faster than I anticipated. An hour later, a sharp knock echoed through my hotel suite. I assumed it was room service bringing up the water I had ordered earlier. Reuben was still on the phone in the other room, so I walked over and opened the heavy wooden door. A man I had never seen before was standing in the hallway. He wore a plain gray suit and carried a worn leather messenger bag. He did not look like hotel staff. He looked at my face, verified something on his clipboard, and asked if I was Leroy. I nodded, keeping my posture completely relaxed. I told him I was Leroy and asked how I could help him. The man did not smile. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy rubber band. He thrust the papers directly into my chest, forcing me to take them. He took a step back, pulled out a digital camera, and took a quick photograph of me holding the documents to prove delivery. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "You have been served." The man turned around and walked briskly down the hallway toward the elevators. I stood in the doorway staring at the thick stack of papers in my hands. The front page bore the official seal of the county family court. My name was listed as the respondent. Kendrick's name was listed as the petitioner. I closed the door and walked back into the living area. Reuben saw the papers and ended his phone call immediately. He rushed over and took the stack from my hands, flipping through the pages with urgent speed. His eyes scanned the legal jargon and his jaw tightened. Kendrick had not waited for the morning. He had taken the fake medical evaluation from Dr. Vance and rushed straight to his lawyer's office. They had filed an emergency petition for full legal and financial guardianship over my person and my estate. The document stated that I was in immediate danger to myself and requested that all my assets be transferred to Kendrick's control pending a final medical review. But the worst part was the date stamped at the very bottom of the subpoena. Reuben looked up at me, his expression grim. He pointed to the highlighted text. The judge had not granted the ex parte order blindly, but she had scheduled an emergency hearing. The hearing was not next week or next month. It was set for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. My son had officially launched his final assault. He was dragging me into a courtroom in less than 24 hours, armed with a fake diagnosis and a desperate hunger for my money. He thought he had ambushed me. He thought he had caught the old man off guard. But as I looked at the subpoena, I did not feel fear. I felt a quiet, chilling anticipation. Kendrick wanted a war in front of a judge. I was going to give him a massacre. The heavy stack of legal papers sat on the glass table of my hotel suite like a loaded weapon. My son Kendrick had officially declared war. He had filed an emergency petition to strip away my civil rights, to label me a senile and violent old man, and to seize total control of my entire life. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock the very next morning. Most men my age would be terrified. Most men would be calling their loved ones in a panic, weeping about the betrayal of their own flesh and blood. But I did not feel panic. I felt a cold and absolute clarity. I looked across the table at my lawyer, Reuben. He was already typing furiously on his laptop, pulling up every piece of financial data he could find on my son and my daughter-in-law. We had less than 24 hours to build a defense that would not just protect my freedom, but absolutely decimate their offensive strike. I told Reuben that defending myself was no longer enough. I did not just want to walk into that courtroom and prove I was sane. I wanted to walk out of that courtroom having dismantled every single piece of the fake empire Kendrick and Khloe had built. I wanted to burn their illusions to the ground. Reuben nodded without looking up from his screen. He understood completely. We had spent the last few decades destroying ruthless commercial contractors and corrupt property developers. Taking down a desperate 42-year-old man and his prejudiced wife was simply a matter of finding the right leverage. Reuben began pulling up their public financial records, their credit reports, and their corporate liabilities. The picture that emerged was even more pathetic than I had imagined. Kendrick was completely underwater. His consulting firm was a hollow shell, generating almost zero revenue. The luxury cars were leased at exorbitant interest rates. The country club memberships were past due, and now he owed $50,000 to a violent street criminal. My son was a financial parasite who had finally run out of hosts to feed on. But Kendrick was only half of the problem. I told Reuben to shift his focus to Khloe. My daughter-in-law was the architect of the smear campaign in my old neighborhood. She was the one who had gleefully pushed the narrative that I was a crazy old black man who needed to be locked away. Khloe loved to present herself as the pinnacle of success. She was a woman who weaponized her privilege at every opportunity. At every family dinner and holiday gathering, she would sit at the head of the table sipping expensive wine and loudly bragging about being a self-made female entrepreneur. She loved to tell my guests that she had built her business from the ground up through sheer hustle and determination. Khloe owned a high-end luxury pet spa right in the middle of the wealthiest downtown commercial district. It was an absurdly lavish establishment. She offered hot stone massages for miniature poodles and sold organic dog food that cost more than a decent steak. The floors were polished marble and the chandeliers were imported crystal. She loved to boast about her prime retail location, acting as if simply occupying that space made her royalty. She constantly looked down her nose at my working-class background. She would make passive-aggressive comments about how manual labor was fine for some people, but real wealth came from innovation and elite branding. She genuinely believed she was a titan of industry, while dismissing the 40 years I spent crawling through asbestos-filled ventilation shafts to build my heating and cooling company. She thought my dirty boots and calloused hands were a sign of inferiority. I asked Ruben to dig into the corporate structure of her luxury pet spa. I wanted to know exactly how much debt she was carrying on that business. If she and Kendrick were going to use the legal system to try and steal my trust fund, I wanted to know if we could legally attach their business assets in a countersuit. Ruben accessed the county business registries and pulled up the commercial lease agreement for Khloe's spa. He needed to see her monthly overhead to understand her vulnerability. The hotel room was quiet except for the steady clicking of Ruben's keyboard. The city lights outside the window began to twinkle as the evening approached. Ruben stared at his computer screen for a long time, his brow furrowed in confusion. He scrolled down the digital document, then scrolled back up, adjusting his glasses. He leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. He looked over at me with an expression of pure bewilderment. He told me that something very strange was going on with Khloe's commercial lease. I asked him what the problem was. I assumed she had forged another signature or perhaps defaulted on a massive small business loan. Ruben turned the laptop around so the screen was facing me. He pointed to the top of the lease agreement where the landlord information was listed. He told me that Khloe did not own the building. She leased the prime retail space from a massive corporate property management entity. That part was normal for downtown commercial real estate. But Ruben pointed to the name of the holding company that owned the entire commercial block. He read the name aloud. The entity was listed as L&V Holdings Incorporated. Ruben told me he recognized the corporate structure, but he could not place it immediately. He said it was a private real estate trust that owned several major commercial properties in the city. He looked at me, expecting me to explain if I had heard of them. I sat perfectly still. My eyes locked onto the glowing screen of the laptop. I read the letters L&V Holdings. A deep, quiet stillness washed over me. It was the kind of stillness that precedes a devastating storm. I felt a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy. It was the smile of a man who just realized he was holding the winning lottery ticket and the executioner's axe at the exact same time. I looked at Ruben and told him he did not recognize the company name because it was designed to be completely invisible. I explained to him that back in the late 1990s, when my commercial HVAC business was pulling in massive government contracts, I had more liquid cash than I knew what to do with. My wife Vivian had always told me that real wealth was not in the labor but in the land. She told me to buy the dirt beneath the buildings, so I took her advice. I created a blind corporate trust to purchase commercial real estate without my name ever appearing on the public deeds. I named the trust L&V Holdings. L for Leroy, V for Vivian. I watched the realization hit Ruben like a physical blow. His eyes widened and his jaw dropped slightly. He looked from the laptop screen to my face and then back to the screen. I told him softly that I bought that entire downtown commercial block 25 years ago. I owned the brick, the mortar, and the dirt underneath the luxury pet spa. I looked my lawyer dead in the eye and told him that Khloe was not a self-made entrepreneur. She was my tenant. I was her landlord. For 3 years, that arrogant woman had sat at my dinner table mocking my blue-collar roots and bragging about her elite downtown business. For 3 years, she had fed me dog food and called me a freeloader while operating her entire fake empire inside a building that I owned. She had absolutely no idea. The property management firm handled all the leases, the rent collection, and the maintenance. My name was buried beneath layers of corporate privacy laws. She thought she was leasing from some faceless billionaire corporation. She never once suspected that the raggedy old black man she banished to her basement was the man who owned the very roof over her business. Ruben let out a sharp, booming laugh that echoed through the hotel suite. It was the laugh of a lawyer who had just found the ultimate kill shot. He shook his head in absolute disbelief and quickly pulled up the internal accounting ledger for L&V Holdings. He logged into the secure portal I used to monitor my property management firm. He navigated to the commercial block and found the specific account for Khloe's luxury pet spa. He checked the payment history and his smile grew even wider. He turned to me and delivered the final piece of the puzzle. He told me that Khloe was financially drowning. According to the property management ledger, she had not paid her commercial rent in 90 days. She was exactly 3 months behind on her lease payments. The management firm had already sent her 2 automatic warnings and was preparing to initiate default proceedings by the end of the week. She was completely broke and operating on borrowed time. Everything made perfect sense now. This was why she was so desperate to declare me mentally incompetent. This was why she pushed Kendrick to hire the corrupt doctor and file the emergency conservatorship. She was days away from losing her precious business and her fake identity. She needed to steal my trust fund to pay the rent she owed to my own holding company. The sheer poetic irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. I stood up from the glass table and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. I looked out over the glowing city skyline, specifically focusing on the downtown commercial district where my building stood. I thought about the sheer disrespect I had endured. I thought about the dog bowl sliding across the marble table. I thought about Khloe wandering through my old neighborhood, weaponizing my age and my race to paint me as a crazy old man. She wanted to strip away my dignity and take everything I had built. But she had walked right into a trap she did not even know existed. I turned back to Ruben. The smile was gone from my face, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. I gave him his final instructions for the night. I told him to contact the property management firm immediately. I told him to bypass the standard warning protocols and draft the official commercial eviction notice right now. Because she was 90 days delinquent, the lease allowed for an immediate lockout. I told Ruben to prepare the documents to seize her inventory and change the locks on the doors of her luxury pet spa by tomorrow morning. Ruben nodded, his fingers flying across the keyboard to draft the devastating legal documents. He asked me if I wanted him to serve her the eviction notice tonight at her mansion so she would know her business was gone before the court hearing. I shook my head slowly. I told him no. I did not want to serve her the papers tonight in the privacy of her home. I wanted her to walk into that family court tomorrow morning completely confident. I wanted her to stand in front of the judge and put on her crying act. I wanted her to play the role of the wealthy, successful daughter-in-law trying to save her poor, sick father-in-law. I told Ruben to hold the eviction notice in his briefcase. I told him I wanted to hand it to her myself in the middle of the courtroom. I wanted to look her dead in the eyes when she realized that the man she called a freeloader had just taken everything she owned. The morning of the meeting, I woke up early and stood in front of the large mirror in my hotel suite. Ruben and I had spent the entire night finalizing the legal documents that would destroy my son and his wife in court the very next day. But before we could drop the hammer on them, I needed one final piece of evidence. I needed to catch them in the act of coercion. I needed a recording of their manipulative threats right out of their own mouths. So I agreed to meet Kendrick and Khloe at a neutral coffee shop downtown. They thought they had finally worn me down. They thought my silence over the past 2 days was a sign of defeat. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly into a trap. I went into my suitcase and pulled out the oldest clothing I could find. I put on a faded gray sweater that had frayed at the cuffs and a pair of worn-out corduroy pants. I did not comb my hair. I let my shoulders slump forward, intentionally curving my spine to look fragile and small. I practiced letting my hands shake just a little bit. If they wanted a broken and senile old man, I was going to give them an award-winning performance. I took a taxi to the coffee shop an hour early. It was a busy, bustling place filled with college students and corporate workers typing on their laptops. The smell of roasted coffee beans and burnt sugar hung heavy in the air. I chose a small wooden table in the very back corner where the shadows were thickest. I sat down and placed my hands flat on the table. I reached into the pocket of my oversized sweater and pressed the record button on a high-definition digital audio device Ruben had given me. I tested the microphone by tapping my fingers softly against the wood. It was working perfectly. I ordered a simple black coffee and waited. 30 minutes later, the bell above the front door chimed and my son walked in. Kendrick was wearing his usual tailored suit, but he looked exhausted. His eyes darted around the room nervously. Khloe walked in right behind him wearing a designer coat and her signature oversized sunglasses. She looked around the coffee shop with obvious disgust, as if breathing the same air as working-class people was a chore. When they finally spotted me sitting in the dark corner, their body language shifted immediately. They straightened their backs and put on their carefully rehearsed masks of fake concern. They pulled out the chairs across from me and sat down. Kendrick placed a thick leather folder on the table between us. I did not look at the folder. I kept my eyes fixed on my shaking hands, staring down at my cold coffee. I let my lower lip tremble slightly, playing the role of a terrified and confused elderly man. Khloe was the first one to speak. She leaned across the table and put her hand over mine. Her skin felt cold, and her touch made my stomach turn, but I did not pull away. I forced myself to look up into her eyes. She put on a sickeningly sweet voice, the kind of voice you use when you are talking to a lost toddler. She told me that they had been so incredibly worried about me. She said that my behavior had been scaring them, and that they just wanted to make sure I was safe. I listened to her lies pouring out like poisoned honey. She told me that I was sick. She used the word sick 3 times in a single sentence to really hammer the manipulation home. She said my mind was slipping and that the basement was no longer a safe place for a man in my deteriorating condition. Khloe smiled a slow, calculating smile and told me they had found a wonderful solution. She claimed they had located a beautiful high-end medical facility in the suburbs where I could receive around-the-clock psychiatric care. She painted a picture of a luxurious retirement home where nurses would tend to my every need. She promised that I would not have to worry about anything ever again. I knew exactly what kind of facility she was talking about. It was the same underfunded state-run nightmare she had screamed about in the basement security footage. She wanted to lock me away in a tiny room, pump me full of sedatives, and throw away the key. Kendrick took over the conversation smoothly. He slid the heavy leather folder closer to me and opened it. Inside was a stack of legal documents printed on thick premium paper. He told me that going to court tomorrow was going to be a terrible and traumatic experience for me. He said the judge would ask me difficult questions, and the public record would show how far my mind had degraded. He played the role of the protective son, trying to spare his father from public humiliation. He told me we could avoid the entire legal circus if I just signed the papers right now. Kendrick tapped the top of the document. He explained that it was a voluntary power of attorney and a full transfer of my estate into his control. He said that if I signed the paper, he would personally handle all my bills, my properties, and my healthcare decisions. He promised me that he would protect my legacy. The sheer audacity of his words was staggering. He was sitting across from me, asking me to hand over the keys to an empire I spent 40 years building in the freezing cold and the blistering heat. He was asking me to surrender my freedom to a man who forged my signature on a loan application just 48 hours ago. Kendrick reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy gold pen. He uncapped it and slid it across the wooden table until it touched my fingertips. He told me to just sign my name on the dotted line and all the pain and confusion would stop. Khloe squeezed my hand again and whispered that it was the right thing to do. She said it was time for me to rest. I stared at the gold pen resting against my worn-out sweater sleeve. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing minute. I needed the audio recorder hidden in my pocket to capture every single second of their predatory pressure. I slowly raised my head and looked at my son. I forced moisture into my eyes until a single fake tear rolled down my wrinkled cheek. I let my voice crack and waver, sounding completely defeated. I told Kendrick that I was just so very tired. I told him that I did not understand all the legal words on the paper and that my head felt heavy. I acted exactly like the broken old man they so desperately needed me to be. I looked down at the contract and slowly pushed the gold pen back across the table. I told them that I could not sign anything today. I let out a soft sob and whispered that I would just let the judge decide tomorrow morning. I said that if the judge looked at me and decided I was truly sick, then I would go to the home peacefully. I told them I just wanted to do whatever the law required of me. Kendrick let out a sharp, frustrated breath, but Khloe quickly kicked his leg under the table. I saw the rapid exchange of looks between them. Kendrick was angry that he did not get the signature right then and there, but Khloe was ecstatic. Her eyes lit up with a greedy, triumphant gleam. She looked at my tears, my shaking hands, and my slumped shoulders. In her mind, the victory was already secured. She genuinely believed that I had surrendered completely. She thought that when we walked into that courtroom tomorrow morning, I would stand before the judge weeping and admitting that I had lost my mind. She believed the hearing would be a mere formality before they gained total control of my massive trust fund. Khloe smiled a genuine arrogant smirk and told me that letting the judge decide was a very brave choice. She packed the documents back into the leather folder with rapid, excited movements. Kendrick smirked too, his confidence fully restored. He told me they would see me in court at 9 o'clock sharp and that everything was going to be perfectly fine. They stood up from the table, leaving my untouched black coffee behind. They did not offer to walk me to my car. They did not ask how I was getting back to my hotel. They simply turned their backs on me and walked out of the coffee shop together, their heads held high as if they had already conquered the world. I sat alone in the dark corner of the bustling room, listening to the chime of the bell as the front door closed behind them. Once they were completely out of sight, I stopped shaking. My shoulders straightened and my posture returned to that of a man who built commercial skyscrapers. The fake tear dried on my cheek. I reached into the deep pocket of my wrinkled sweater and pressed the stop button on the digital audio device. I saved the file securely, backing it up to the cloud server my lawyer had configured. I had captured every single twisted lie, every manipulative threat, and every fake promise they had just uttered. I picked up the black coffee and took a slow, satisfying sip. It was cold, but it tasted like absolute victory. Kendrick and Khloe thought they had just manipulated a senile old man into giving up without a fight. They thought the courtroom tomorrow was going to be a slaughter. They were absolutely right about the slaughter, but they were completely wrong about who was holding the axe. I sat there reviewing the master plan in my head. I thought about the 3 neurological evaluations sitting in the briefcase of my lawyer, proving my mind was in the top 1 percentile. I thought about the commercial eviction notice ready to destroy the luxury pet spa belonging to Khloe, and now I had the definitive audio proof of their malicious coercion. I placed a $20 bill on the wooden table, adjusted my collar, and walked out of the coffee shop into the bright afternoon sun. I was ready for tomorrow. I was ready to watch their fake empire burn to ashes. The ride up the glass elevator to my penthouse suite was incredibly quiet. I watched the city shrink below me as I ascended. The moment I stepped out of the elevator and walked down the plush carpeted hallway, I felt a profound physical shift. I unlocked the heavy oak door of my suite and stepped inside. I did not bother turning on the main lights. The glow from the city skyline was more than enough. I walked directly into the bathroom and stood in front of the large vanity mirror. I looked at the old, wrinkled sweater I was wearing. It was frayed at the edges and smelled like the cheap coffee from the cafe where I had just let my son and his wife believe they had defeated me. I gripped the hem of that ugly sweater, pulled it over my head, and threw it directly into the trash can. It had served its purpose perfectly. The frail, confused old man they so desperately wanted me to be was gone forever. I walked into the spacious walk-in closet of the hotel suite. Hanging right in the center was the armor I would wear to battle tomorrow morning. It was a custom-tailored charcoal gray suit made of the finest Italian wool. I had it made years ago for a major commercial real estate negotiation. It was the kind of suit that demanded absolute respect the moment you walked into a room. I ran my calloused hands over the smooth fabric. Tomorrow I would not be slumping my shoulders. I would not be shaking my hands or letting my voice waver. Tomorrow I would walk into that family court as Leroy, the founder of a commercial empire and the landlord of the very woman trying to destroy me. I laid the suit carefully across the pristine white sheets of the hotel bed. I polished my black leather Oxford shoes until they shined like glass. I was meticulously preparing for the most important execution of my life. A sharp knock echoed through the quiet suite. I opened the door to find my lawyer Ruben standing in the hallway. He was not smiling. His face carried the intense, focused expression of a man preparing for a brutal legal war. He carried 2 massive leather briefcases that looked heavy enough to break a man's arm. I stepped aside and let him enter. We did not exchange pleasantries. We did not offer small talk about the weather or the traffic. We walked straight to the large glass dining table overlooking the city and opened the briefcases. We were about to build a guillotine made entirely out of paper. Ruben pulled out a thick, heavy-duty binder. It was completely black and ominously thick. He opened it and placed it right in the center of the table. He told me that we needed to review every single page to ensure there were absolutely no gaps in our defense and no escape routes for our enemies. We started with the first section. Ruben carefully placed the 3 independent neurological evaluations into the binder. I had spent hours over the last 2 days sitting with the top medical experts in the state. They subjected me to rigorous cognitive tests, memory evaluations, and psychological screenings. All 3 doctors concluded the exact same thing. My brain was functioning in the top 1 percentile for my age. I was sharper, more lucid, and more capable than most men half my age. This single section of the binder completely vaporized the fake medical certificate Kendrick had purchased. But proving my sanity was only the beginning. We were not just playing defense. We were going on the offensive. Ruben turned to the second tab in the binder. This was the financial fraud section. He laid out the high-resolution copies of the documents from my bank. They clearly showed my son's desperate attempt to secure a $50,000 loan against my life insurance policy. More importantly, they clearly showed the forged signature at the bottom of the page. Ruben explained that this was not just a simple family dispute. This was elder financial abuse and federal bank fraud. He told me that the judge would be legally obligated to notify law enforcement the moment she saw these documents. Kendrick was going to walk into the courtroom hoping to get a conservatorship, and he was going to walk out in handcuffs. The third tab was where the trap grew even darker. Ruben pulled out the glossy, high-resolution photographs taken by Marcus, our private investigator. I stared at the images spread across the glass table. There was my son sitting in a filthy diner sliding a thick envelope of cash across a sticky table to Dr. Vance, the disgraced psychiatrist. Ruben had attached a detailed background report on Dr. Vance highlighting his previous suspensions and his history of unethical medical practices. When the judge saw these photographs, she would instantly realize that Kendrick had bribed a corrupt doctor to write a fake evaluation without ever examining me. The crime was premeditated, malicious, and entirely undeniable. Then we moved to the fourth tab. This was the audio evidence. Ruben had taken the digital files from the hidden camera in my basement and the audio recorder from my pocket at the coffee shop and had them officially transcribed by a certified court reporter. I read the transcripts of their own words. I read Khloe's hateful voice demanding they lock me in a state-run nursing home so they could take everything. I read Kendrick's agreement to purchase the fake evaluation for $5,000. I read the transcript from just a few hours ago where they tried to coerce me into signing away my entire estate while pretending to care about my health. Reading their lies printed out in stark black and white made my chest tight with a cold, familiar anger. They had planned to erase my humanity just so they could keep leasing expensive cars and drinking imported wine. They were parasites, and tomorrow they were going to be permanently detached from their host. Finally, Ruben reached into the very bottom of his briefcase. He pulled out a single manila folder and handed it to me. I opened it slowly. Inside was the absolute masterpiece of our legal strategy. It was the official commercial eviction notice for the luxury pet spa located downtown. The document was flawless. It cited the exact clauses in the commercial lease agreement that Khloe had violated by failing to pay her rent for the past 90 days. It was signed by me, the majority equity holder and sole owner of L&V Holdings. I looked at the eviction order and felt a deep, satisfying calm wash over me. Ruben leaned back in his chair and explained the logistics of tomorrow morning. He told me that he had already coordinated with the property management firm and a private security company. He said that at exactly 8:00 tomorrow morning, 1 hour before our court hearing began, a team of movers and a locksmith would arrive at Khloe's precious business. They would legally change the locks on the front doors. They would pack up her organic dog treats, her expensive display cases, and her imported chandeliers. They would place her entire fake empire in boxes on the public sidewalk. While she was sitting in the courtroom trying to steal my money to save her business would already be gone. She was going to lose absolutely everything. Ruben closed the heavy black binder. The sound echoed in the quiet suite. He looked at me and told me that the presiding official tomorrow would be Honorable Judge Davis. He explained that Judge Davis was a strict, no-nonsense African-American woman who had built her career protecting vulnerable citizens from predatory relatives. He said she despised courtroom theatrics and had zero tolerance for elder abuse. Ruben smiled a grim, satisfied smile. He told me that Kendrick and Khloe were walking into an absolute massacre. They were bringing a fake piece of paper to a gunfight, and they had no idea who they were really dealing with. I thanked Ruben for his loyalty and his brilliant legal mind. He packed up his empty briefcases, shook my hand firmly, and walked out of the hotel suite. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. I was completely alone. The city below me was dark now, the streetlights looking like a sea of distant stars. The silence in the room was profound, but it was not a lonely silence. It was the silence of a battlefield just hours before the dawn. I walked over to the small nightstand next to the bed. Sitting there was a silver-framed photograph I had brought with me from the basement. It was a picture of my late wife, Vivian. The photo was taken 30 years ago, right after we bought our first major commercial property. She was wearing a simple yellow dress and smiling so brightly it could light up a room. Her eyes held the kind of fierce, unconditional love that Kendrick and Khloe could never comprehend. Vivian had worked side by side with me, scrubbing floors and balancing budget books late into the night. We built our empire together with calloused hands and unwavering faith. She had told me long ago that real wealth was not about showing off to strangers, but about building a foundation that could weather any storm. I picked up the silver frame and held it carefully in my hands. I traced the edge of her smiling face with my thumb. I thought about how much she had loved Kendrick when he was just a little boy. I thought about how much it would break her heart to see the cruel, greedy man he had chosen to become. But I also knew that Vivian was a protector. She would never allow a pair of arrogant, entitled parasites to destroy everything we sacrificed our youth to build. She would expect me to stand tall to defend our legacy and to crush anyone who tried to steal our dignity. I looked deeply into her beautiful face in the photograph. I felt a quiet, powerful resolve settle into my soul. I knew exactly what I had to do. I spoke to her softly, my voice steady and unwavering in the quiet hotel room. I told her that tomorrow we clean out the trash, Viv. The morning air was crisp and unforgiving as I stepped out of the black sedan in front of the county family courthouse. I adjusted the cuffs of my custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. The Italian wool felt like armor against the chill of the wind and the chill of what was about to happen. I walked up the wide concrete steps with the steady, measured pace of a man who had spent 40 years building commercial skyscrapers. I did not need a cane. I did not hunch my shoulders. I held my head high. Today was the day my son would attempt to erase my humanity legally and permanently. I walked through the heavy metal detectors and navigated the bustling hallways of the courthouse. The air smelled of old paper floor wax and desperation. Families were huddled in corners, whispering fiercely. Lawyers in cheap suits rushed past carrying overflowing folders. But I was not rushing. I was perfectly on time. I found courtroom 4B and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The room was mostly empty, save for the court clerk organizing files and my son sitting at the petitioner's table. Kendrick was wearing a sharp-tailored navy blue suit that he likely bought on credit. He sat rigidly next to a slick-looking lawyer who was busy arranging documents into neat little piles. Next to Kendrick sat his wife, Khloe. She had abandoned her usual glamorous designer dresses for a modest beige cardigan and a simple white blouse. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and she wore no makeup. She was actively playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken daughter-in-law. When the heavy courtroom doors clicked shut behind me, their heads snapped around. For a fraction of a second, I saw absolute shock wash over Kendrick's face. He was expecting the frail, trembling old man in the wrinkled sweater from the coffee shop. He was expecting a broken senior citizen who had given up. Instead, he saw the founder of Marcus & Sons Heating and Cooling. He saw the man who had silently funded his entire fake life. I did not sit behind them. I walked directly to the respondent's table and took my seat, maintaining a completely neutral expression. Kendrick quickly looked away, staring down at the polished wooden table. Khloe leaned over and whispered frantically into his ear. 10 minutes later, the bailiff announced the arrival of the judge. We all stood as the Honorable Judge Davis entered the courtroom. Reuben had told me about her last night, and seeing her in person confirmed every word. Judge Davis was an African-American woman in her late 50s with sharp, observant eyes and a demeanor that commanded absolute respect. She did not look like a woman who tolerated fools or courtroom theatrics. She took her seat at the high bench, adjusted her glasses, and opened the file in front of her. She looked down at the paperwork and then looked up, scanning the room. Her eyes rested on me for a moment, and I held her gaze with calm, quiet dignity. Judge Davis called the court to order. She announced that this was an emergency ex parte hearing for a temporary conservatorship regarding the estate and person of Leroy Marcus. She turned her attention to Kendrick's table and asked the petitioner's counsel to state their case. Kendrick's lawyer stood up. He was a tall, slender man with a smooth voice that dripped with fake sympathy. He buttoned his suit jacket and addressed the judge. He began by painting a tragic, fabricated portrait of my life. He told the court that I was a widower who had suffered a catastrophic mental decline over the past 3 years since the passing of my beloved wife. He used words like tragic deterioration and heartbreaking paranoia. He claimed that Kendrick and Khloe had graciously taken me into their home to care for me, but that my condition had recently escalated into severe aggression. I sat perfectly still, listening to a stranger dismantle my character for a paycheck. The lawyer told the judge that I had been wandering the streets at night, confused and hostile. He blatantly lied, stating that I had caused a violent disturbance at a family birthday dinner just a few days ago, throwing food across the room and screaming at their guests. He was twisting the dog food incident, turning their cruel mockery into a symptom of my supposed madness. Khloe buried her face in her hands and let out a soft, calculated sob. She was putting on an award-winning performance, playing the victim of a deranged old man. Kendrick put his arm around her shoulders, comforting her while keeping his eyes firmly locked on the floor. The lawyer continued his relentless assault. He told Judge Davis that my paranoia had reached a dangerous peak. He claimed that I had inexplicably canceled all of my auto-pay bills and frozen my own bank accounts out of a delusional belief that my family was trying to steal from me. He said that my reckless financial behavior was going to ruin my estate and leave me entirely destitute. He painted my defensive actions as the very proof of my insanity. He argued that a man in his right mind would never cut off the son who was selflessly providing him with a roof over his head. Judge Davis listened intently. Her face was completely unreadable. She wrote a few notes on her legal pad and asked the lawyer what specific medical evidence he was providing to support such severe claims. This was the moment they had paid $5,000 for. This was the moment the trap was supposed to snap shut on my neck. The lawyer reached into his perfectly organized file and pulled out a thin blue folder. He walked the document up to the bailiff, who handed it directly to the judge. The lawyer stated confidently that they had procured an expedited psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Arthur Vance, a licensed medical professional in the state. He told the court that Dr. Vance had diagnosed me with advanced Alzheimer's disease complicated by violent paranoid delusions. The lawyer read excerpts from the fake report out loud. He read the lies stating that I was completely detached from reality, that I lacked the basic cognitive function to manage a checking account, and that I posed an imminent physical danger to my son and daughter-in-law. Khloe let out another loud, pathetic sob. She wiped her dry eyes with a tissue and looked up at the judge with a pleading expression. She was trying to leverage every ounce of her privilege, hoping the judge would look at her and see a terrified, innocent woman who just needed the court's protection from a dangerous black man. But Judge Davis did not look at Khloe. She kept her eyes fixed on the medical certificate. The lawyer returned to his table and delivered his final demands. He requested that the court immediately grant Kendrick full legal and financial guardianship over my entire estate. He asked for an emergency order to unfreeze my bank accounts and transfer all signatory rights to his client. He claimed this was necessary to prevent me from squandering my life savings, and then he delivered the final crushing blow. He requested a court order for forced institutionalization. He asked the judge to mandate that I be removed from the premises by medical transport and placed into a secure state-run psychiatric facility for my own safety and the safety of the public. The courtroom fell completely silent. The sheer weight of their demands hung heavily in the air. They were asking the court to strip away my freedom, my money, and my voice in a single stroke of a pen. They wanted to lock me in a white room and throw away the key so they could pay their mortgage and keep buying designer handbags. Kendrick finally looked up at me. He tried to hide it, but I saw the arrogant smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He thought he had won. He thought the medical certificate was an unbeatable royal flush. He thought I was just a tired old man sitting alone at a defense table without a shred of proof to fight back. Judge Davis finished reading the document. She placed the file down on her bench and folded her hands together. She looked across the courtroom directly at me. I could see a flicker of genuine pity in her eyes. She saw an elderly man sitting completely alone, facing the absolute destruction of his life. She had presided over hundreds of these cases. She had seen greedy relatives tear apart vulnerable seniors time and time again. She took a slow, deep breath and addressed me directly. Her voice was gentle but firm. She asked me if I understood the severity of the claims being made against me today. I simply nodded my head, keeping my posture straight and my hands perfectly still on the wooden table. I did not speak out of turn. I respected the court. Judge Davis looked around the empty space around me. She leaned forward slightly and asked the question that Kendrick and Khloe had been praying I would answer with a confused no. "Mr. Leroy," she said, her voice echoing in the quiet room, "do you have legal counsel present here today to represent your interests?" Before I could even open my mouth to answer, the heavy wooden doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a massive resounding crash. The sound echoed off the high ceilings, making Kendrick and his slick lawyer jump in their seats. Khloe gasped and spun around. Striding down the center aisle was Reuben. He moved with the aggressive, relentless energy of a legal predator who had just spotted his prey. He was wearing a sharp-tailored pinstripe suit and carrying two massive black leather briefcases that looked like they contained the weight of the world. His footsteps echoed loudly on the polished floor, breaking the quiet tension of the courtroom. He did not look at Kendrick. He did not look at Khloe. He kept his eyes locked dead ahead on the judge. Reuben reached my table, slammed the heavy briefcases down on the solid wood, and looked up at the bench. His voice was loud, confident, and completely unapologetic. "He certainly does, Your Honor," Reuben declared, projecting his voice so every single person in the room could feel the absolute authority in his words. and we moved for immediate dismissal and criminal charges. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom slowly swung shut behind Ruben, sealing my son and my daughter-in-law inside the trap they had built for me. The silence in the room was so profound that you could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Judge Davis leaned forward slightly, peering over her reading glasses at the man who had just marched into her courtroom like a conquering general. She asked Ruben to state his name and his business before her bench. Ruben did not miss a beat. He stood tall, adjusted the lapels of his custom pinstripe suit, and introduced himself as my lead legal counsel. He stated his full name and his firm, providing his credentials with a sharp, crisp authority. He informed the judge that he had represented my commercial real estate interests for over 30 years, and that he was here today to completely dismantle the absurd and malicious petition filed by my son. Kendrick's lawyer immediately jumped to his feet. His slick confidence from just moments ago was rapidly evaporating. He stammered out an objection, claiming that Ruben had not filed a formal appearance on the record and that this emergency hearing was not the proper venue for a surprise defense. He told the judge that his clients were acting out of desperate concern for a severely ill old man, and that my sudden legal representation was just further proof of my erratic paranoia. Judge Davis raised her hand. It was a simple, quiet gesture, but it carried the weight of a sledgehammer. Kendrick's lawyer stopped talking instantly and slowly sat back down. Judge Davis looked at Ruben and told him that she would allow his appearance on the record. She instructed him to proceed with his motion for dismissal, but she warned him that he better have substantial evidence to back up his aggressive entrance. She reminded him that the petitioners had submitted a sworn medical certificate declaring me a danger to myself and to the public. Ruben smiled a tight, predatory smile. He thanked the judge and unlocked the brass clasps of his first leather briefcase. The loud click echoed across the silent room. He reached inside and pulled out the thin blue folder that contained the fake medical report from Dr. Arthur Vance. He held it up by the very edge of the paper as if it were something filthy and diseased. He addressed the court with a booming, steady voice. He told Judge Davis that the petitioner's entire case rested on a single piece of paper, signed by a man whose medical license had been repeatedly suspended for ethical violations and prescription fraud. Ruben stated that Dr. Vance had diagnosed me with advanced Alzheimer's disease and violent paranoia without ever once stepping foot in the same room as me. He told the judge that I had never been examined by this doctor. I had never been interviewed by this doctor. I had never even been within 10 miles of his medical practice. Khloe shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her fake tears had completely dried up. She looked at Kendrick, her eyes wide with rising panic. Kendrick stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. Their lawyer stood up again, attempting to object. He claimed that Dr. Vance had conducted a thorough telemedicine review based on extensive family interviews and behavioral logs. He insisted that the diagnosis was legally binding and medically sound. Ruben did not even look at Kendrick's lawyer. He simply turned back to his briefcase and pulled out a stack of pristine, thick white envelopes bearing the official seals of the top 3 medical institutions in the state. He walked over to the bailiff and handed the heavy stack of documents up to the judge's bench. Ruben announced that he was submitting 3 independent neurological evaluations into evidence. He made sure to speak slowly and clearly so that every single person in the courtroom could hear the credentials of the experts we had hired. The first evaluation was conducted by the chief of neurology at the State University Hospital. The second was from a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in cognitive decline. The third was from a highly decorated clinical psychologist. Ruben explained that over the last 48 hours I had voluntarily subjected myself to the most rigorous and exhaustive mental competency exams available in modern medicine. I had undergone full brain magnetic resonance imaging. I had completed hours of complex memory recall tests, logic puzzles, and psychological profiling. He told the judge that all 3 of these highly respected, uncompromised medical professionals had reached the exact same undeniable conclusion. Ruben looked directly at Kendrick and delivered the results. He stated that my brain was not just healthy, it was functioning in the top 1 percentile for a man of my age. He told the court that my cognitive acuity, my memory retention, and my executive decision-making skills were absolutely flawless. He declared that I was more mentally capable than most of the people sitting in the courtroom today. He made it perfectly clear that I was fully capable of managing my massive commercial real estate portfolio, and that the claim of dementia was a complete and utter fabrication. Judge Davis put on her glasses and opened the sealed envelopes. She read the first evaluation, then she read the second. She flipped through the detailed brain scan reports and the sworn affidavits from the 3 renowned doctors. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the rustle of the heavy paper as she turned the pages. I watched her posture change. The professional neutrality she had maintained earlier began to slip away. It was replaced by a cold, hardened fury. She realized she was being used. She realized that my son and his slick lawyer were attempting to use her courtroom to commit a horrific crime against an innocent elderly man. Kendrick was sweating profusely now. The collar of his expensive dress shirt was soaked. He kept looking toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom as if he were contemplating making a run for it. Khloe was breathing heavily, her hands trembling in her lap. The narrative they had carefully constructed in my old neighborhood, the lies they had spread to my friends, the fake pity they had displayed just moments ago, everything was collapsing around them in real time. Their lawyer stood up one more time. His voice was no longer smooth. It was shaky and desperate. He tried to argue that even if my cognitive function was intact, my recent financial decisions were deeply concerning. He claimed that my sudden refusal to pay for my son's living expenses was proof of a sudden personality shift that required court intervention. He was grasping at straws, trying to keep his sinking ship afloat. Reuben let out a short, bitter laugh. He told the lawyer that choosing to stop paying the mortgage of a 42-year-old man who treats his father like a dog is not a symptom of mental illness. It is a symptom of finally waking up. Reuben stated that the only financial irresponsibility happening in this family was Kendrick's staggering mountain of debt and Khloe's reckless luxury spending. But Reuben was not finished. The medical reversal was only the first part of the execution. We had completely destroyed their offensive strategy, but now it was time to drop the absolute kill shot. Reuben turned back to his table and opened his second black briefcase. He told Judge Davis that establishing my sanity was important, but establishing the petitioner's criminality was vital. He stated that the fake medical certificate from Dr. Vance was not just a tragic misdiagnosis. It was a purchased lie. It was a premeditated, coordinated criminal conspiracy designed to strip a wealthy black man of his hard-earned estate. Reuben reached into the briefcase and pulled out a large manila folder. He opened it and extracted the high-resolution, glossy 8x10 photographs taken by Marcus, our private investigator. Reuben held the first photograph up high so the entire courtroom could see it. He described the image with ruthless precision. He told the judge that the photograph showed Kendrick sitting in a filthy 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. He pointed out the man sitting across from my son, identifying him for the record as Dr. Arthur Vance, the very same doctor who signed the fraudulent medical certificate currently resting on the judge's bench. Reuben pulled out the second photograph and held it up. This image was even more damning. It captured the exact moment my son reached across the sticky diner table and handed a thick brown envelope to the disgraced doctor. Reuben informed the court that the envelope contained $5,000 in untraceable cash. He explained that Kendrick had explicitly purchased his father's mental destruction for $5,000 because he was desperately trying to avoid foreclosure on his mansion. Reuben handed the stack of photographs to the bailiff who carried them up to the high bench. Reuben stated that he also had high-definition audio recordings of Kendrick and the doctor discussing the bribe, the fake diagnosis, and the plan to lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward against my will. He offered to play the audio files for the court right then and there. Judge Davis took the photographs. She looked at the first image showing Kendrick and the doctor. She looked at the second image showing the clear exchange of the cash envelope. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The air felt heavy and charged with electricity. Judge Davis slowly lowered the photographs. Her face was an absolute mask of righteous fury. The veins in her neck were visibly pulsing. She slowly took off her reading glasses and placed them on her desk. She did not look at Reuben. She did not look at me. She turned her fierce, unyielding gaze directly toward Kendrick's table. She locked eyes with his slick lawyer, who was now visibly shaking. She leaned over her high wooden bench, her voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper that echoed in the dead, silent room. "Counselor," she said, her voice dripping with pure venom, "is your client submitting fraudulent medical records to my court?" Kendrick went completely pale. Every ounce of blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He slumped back in his chair, his arrogant posture completely broken. He knew it was over. He knew he was not walking out of this building as a free man. I sat at my table, my hands perfectly still, my heart beating with calm, steady satisfaction. The trap had closed exactly as I had planned. The courtroom was completely paralyzed by the heavy silence following the judge's question. Kendrick's lawyer was physically shaking. He looked at the photographs of the medical bribe sitting on the bench, and then looked at my son with an expression of pure terror. The slick, confident attorney who had just spent 20 minutes calling me a dangerous lunatic suddenly realized his own career was on the line. He stammered and apologized to the court, claiming he had absolutely no knowledge of how those medical records were obtained. He was throwing my son under the bus to save his own legal license. Kendrick realized he was rapidly losing his shield. He stood up unprompted. His expensive tailored suit suddenly looked far too big for his shrinking posture. His voice cracked as he spoke directly to the judge. He told Judge Davis that there was a misunderstanding about the doctor, but he desperately pivoted his strategy knowing the medical angle was completely dead. He raised his hands and shouted that regardless of the psychiatric report, his father was financially out of control. He claimed I was actively destroying the family legacy. He told the judge that I was recklessly canceling accounts, hiding assets, and acting with severe financial irresponsibility. He pleaded with the court, saying that if I was not stopped immediately, I would end up homeless and destitute. It was a pathetic display. He was clinging to the very last thread of his fabricated narrative, trying to paint me as an incompetent old man who could not be trusted to manage a checking account. Ruben did not object to this outburst. He did not interrupt my son. He let Kendrick dig the hole a little deeper so that he could never climb out. When Kendrick finally stopped talking, Ruben calmly walked over to the evidence table. He pulled out a small portable digital projector from his second leather briefcase. He connected it to his laptop and aimed the lens at the blank white wall of the courtroom. He politely asked the judge for permission to address the wild accusations of financial irresponsibility. Judge Davis gave a curt nod, her eyes still burning with anger from the forged medical certificate. Ruben clicked a button on his computer, and a massive digital document illuminated the courtroom wall. The bright light washed over the dark mahogany furniture. It was a bank statement from my primary corporate trust account. Ruben walked up to the projected image. He pointed to a highlighted line item that repeated month after month, year after year. He told the court that my son was accusing me of losing my mind and squandering my wealth. But Ruben explained with a slow, deliberate cadence that I had not lost my mind at all. I had simply found my self-respect. Ruben looked directly at Judge Davis. He stated loudly and clearly that his client did not go crazy. His client simply stopped paying his 42-year-old son's $8,000 monthly mortgage. The entire courtroom let out a collective gasp. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a fraction of a second. Kendrick physically recoiled, as if he had been struck in the chest. Ruben clicked his presentation to the next slide, projecting the original mortgage documents onto the wall. They clearly showed Kendrick's name alongside my own as the silent guarantor and primary equity holder. Ruben explained to the judge that my son lived in a $1.5 million mansion, drove imported luxury cars, and hosted extravagant dinner parties, all while secretly relying on his elderly black father to keep the lights on. Ruben showed the exact date and time I canceled the automatic transfer. It perfectly coincided with the exact moment Kendrick panicked and filed the emergency petition for conservatorship. Ruben turned to face the gallery and stated that the petitioner did not file this lawsuit to protect his vulnerable father. He filed this lawsuit because his free ride had come to an abrupt and devastating end. The wealthy, successful businessman facade was violently stripped away from my son. He was completely exposed. He was nothing but a desperate, broke, middle-aged man throwing a legal tantrum because his allowance was cut off. But Ruben was not finished. He clicked to the next slide, and a new set of bank statements appeared on the wall. This time, they belonged to the joint credit card account I had generously opened years ago for family emergencies. Ruben looked over at Khloe. My daughter-in-law was sinking lower and lower into her chair, trying to make herself invisible beneath her beige cardigan. Ruben read the recent charges out loud for the public record. He read the transactions from Prada, from Gucci, and from elite organic pet boutiques. He told the judge that this exclusive black card was entirely funded by my commercial heating and cooling empire. He stated that Khloe spent upwards of $4,000 a month on designer handbags and luxury dog treats using the money of the very man she had publicly called a freeloader just days prior. Ruben let the heavy irony of that word hang in the quiet courtroom. He asked the judge how a man could be considered financially irresponsible when his only action was cutting off the financial parasites who were sucking his accounts dry. I sat at my table with my hands perfectly still and watched my daughter-in-law tremble. She had spent years dropping subtle racist microaggressions, making sure I knew I did not belong in her elite social circles. She had fed me dog food in front of 20 people to prove her superiority, and now her entire fake life was projected onto a courtroom wall, proving she was nothing without the money I made from crawling through dusty ventilation shafts. She was the ultimate freeloader, and everyone in the room knew it. Kendrick was breathing heavily. His hands gripped the edge of the petitioner's table so tightly his knuckles turned white. He tried to open his mouth to offer some kind of excuse, but no words came out. He was completely trapped by the undeniable truth of his own financial failures. But Ruben was not satisfied with merely humiliating them. He turned off the projector and the room went slightly dark before the fluorescent lights adjusted to the change. Ruben walked back to his heavy black leather briefcase. He told Judge Davis that financial parasitism was a moral failing, but it was not necessarily a crime. However, he stated that what happened next was absolutely a matter for the criminal justice system. Ruben reached into his briefcase and pulled out a crisp, clear plastic folder. He told the court that when the bank accounts were legally frozen, Kendrick panicked. My son realized that without my money, his mansion would be foreclosed on and his luxury cars would be repossessed by the end of the month. Ruben walked the folder up to the judge's bench with slow, deliberate steps. He explained that just 48 hours ago, Kendrick walked into the main branch of my bank and attempted to take out a massive $50,000 cash advance loan. He told the court that the loan was being taken against the accumulated cash value of my lifelong whole life insurance policy. Kendrick stared at Ruben, his eyes wide with a brand new kind of terror. He did not know we had this evidence. He thought the bank had just rejected him for a technical error. He had no idea he was being watched. Ruben explained to Judge Davis that the bank rejected the loan because I had recently instituted a biometric security freeze on all my corporate and personal assets. But the bank kept the submitted paperwork for their fraud department. Ruben pulled out the final page of the loan application and held it up so the judge could see the bottom of the document. He pointed to the signature line. He stated clearly and without any hesitation that my son had forged my signature on a major financial document in a desperate attempt to steal $50,000 in cash. The silence in the courtroom was terrifying. Ruben looked at Kendrick with absolute disgust. He told the court that forging a signature to defraud a federally insured financial institution is not a simple family dispute over an inheritance. It is a severe federal crime. He stated that Kendrick was committing felony identity theft and bank fraud while simultaneously trying to use this very courtroom to declare his victim insane so he could cover his tracks. Kendrick slowly sank into his chair. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and hollow. He looked at his lawyer for help, but his lawyer had physically moved his chair several inches away, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a federal fraud case. The realization finally hit my son with the force of a freight train. He was not just losing a civil lawsuit for guardianship. He was not just losing his mansion, his luxury cars, and his fake reputation in the community. He was looking at a very real and very long federal prison sentence. The trap I had carefully constructed had closed perfectly around his neck, and there was absolutely no way out. The heavy silence in the courtroom was absolute after Ruben exposed the forged life insurance documents. The air felt thick and suffocating. I sat perfectly still at the defense table watching the total destruction of my son's fake empire. Kendrick had completely collapsed in on himself. His shoulders were slumped forward and his head hung low. He looked like a deflated balloon. His slick attorney was already sliding his chair away from the table, silently distancing himself from a client who was about to be indicted for federal bank fraud. The attorney kept his eyes fixed on his legal pad, refusing to look at Kendrick or the judge. He knew the case was dead and his only priority now was saving his own legal license. But beside Kendrick sat Khloe. My daughter-in-law was experiencing a very different kind of reaction. Khloe was a woman who had built her entire existence on the illusion of superiority. She survived on the belief that she was inherently better than everyone else around her simply because of the designer clothes she wore and the wealthy social circles she forced her way into. For 3 years, she had looked down on me. She had used my race and my working-class background as a twisted justification for her cruelty. She genuinely believed that because I worked with my hands, because I fixed air conditioners and crawled through dirty ventilation shafts, I was somehow less than human. She thought my calloused hands made me stupid. As Ruben presented the undeniable proof of my wealth and my absolute mental clarity, The foundation of Khloe's entire worldview began to crack. She could not process the reality unfolding in front of her. The cognitive dissonance was simply too massive for her fragile, arrogant ego to handle. She was watching a black man, a man she had banished to a damp basement, dismantle her husband with ruthless corporate precision. She realized in real time that the luxury bags, the sports cars, and the $1.5 million mansion were not paid for by Kendrick's success. They were paid for by the very man she had mocked and humiliated in front of 20 people just a few nights ago. The panic inside her began to boil over into pure, unadulterated rage. People like Khloe do not apologize when they are proven wrong. They attack. They lash out like cornered animals trying to tear down whoever exposed their failures. I watched her breathing grow rapid and shallow. Her chest heaved beneath her modest beige cardigan. Her face, which she had tried to keep composed in a mask of fake sorrow, turned a dark, angry shade of red. The veins in her neck stood out sharply. Suddenly, the heavy wooden chair screeched loudly against the polished courtroom floor. Khloe pushed herself up from the table. She completely abandoned the sweet, concerned daughter-in-law act she had been playing for the judge. She ignored the basic rules of courtroom decorum. She stood up and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice broke through the quiet room like shattering glass. She started screaming. Her tone was shrill and piercing, echoing off the high ceilings. She yelled that this entire proceeding was completely absurd. She shouted that I was lying to the court. She turned her wild eyes toward Judge Davis and demanded that the judge stop listening to my lawyer immediately. Khloe lost total control of her mouth and her mind. The ugly, toxic prejudice she had kept hidden behind polite microaggressions finally spilled out for the entire public record to hear. She screamed that I was nothing but a raggedy old heating and cooling worker. She yelled that I spent my whole life crawling around in the dirt and that a man like me could never possibly have this kind of money. She told the judge that I must be stealing from Kendrick. She actually accused me, the man who had funded her entire lifestyle, of embezzling money from her broke and desperate husband. She did not stop there. The venom just kept pouring out. She shouted that I was an ungrateful burden. She yelled that I belonged down in the basement where they had put me. She screamed that I should be on my knees thanking them for even allowing me to eat in their beautiful home. She brought up the dog food incident not with shame but with twisted pride. She told the courtroom that organic dog kibble was too good for a freeloader like me. She laid her racism and her classism completely bare. She showed the judge, the bailiff, the court reporter, and every single person in the gallery exactly who she was and exactly why I had cut them off. The reaction in the courtroom was instantaneous. The court reporter stopped typing and stared at her in absolute shock. The bailiff instinctively rested his hand on his utility belt, taking a step toward the petitioner's table. Kendrick grabbed the hem of Khloe's cardigan and yanked on it, pulling her downward. He was crying now, begging her in a harsh whisper to shut her mouth. He knew she was digging their graves 10 feet deeper with every word she screamed, but she slapped his hand away. She was entirely consumed by her own malicious pride. Judge Davis sat at the high bench, her face a mask of absolute cold fury. Judge Davis was a brilliant, sharp African-American woman who had undoubtedly dealt with entitled, prejudiced people like Khloe throughout her entire legal career. She reached for her wooden gavel, preparing to strike it down and hold my daughter-in-law in direct contempt of court. But I did not want the judge to silence her just yet. I did not need the court to fight my battles. I placed my large, calloused hands flat against the solid oak defense table. I pushed my chair back slowly, making a soft, deliberate sound. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my custom-tailored Italian wool suit and squared my shoulders. I stood at my full height, projecting the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who had built a commercial empire from nothing. The moment I stood up, the energy in the room shifted entirely. My physical presence demanded absolute silence, and even Khloe felt it. Her frantic screaming slowly died down into heavy, angry panting. She stared at me, her chest heaving, waiting for me to yell back. She wanted a screaming match. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could point at me and tell the judge that I was dangerous and aggressive. I did not give her what she wanted. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I spoke in a deep, resonant tone that carried through the silent courtroom like a low roll of thunder. I looked directly into her panicked eyes. I kept my face completely devoid of emotion. I repeated her words back to her, slowly letting them hang in the heavy air. A raggedy heating and cooling worker. I nodded my head slightly as if considering the insult. I told her that it was true that I had spent decades coming home with grease on my hands and dirt under my fingernails. I told her that I wore those calluses like badges of honor because they paid for everything she mistakenly thought she owned. Then I took a single step out from behind the defense table. I kept my eyes locked on hers, refusing to let her look away. I asked her a very simple question. I asked her to think about her precious luxury pet spa downtown, the business she bragged about at every dinner party, the business she used to prove she was an elite self-made entrepreneur. I asked her to tell me if she knew the name of the corporate entity that owned the commercial building where her business operated. I asked her if she had ever bothered to read the landlord information on the commercial lease agreement she signed 3 years ago. Khloe blinked. The angry red color in her cheeks began to fade into a sickly pale white. The confusion in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a creeping, paralyzing dread. She realized I was not asking a hypothetical question. She realized that the raggedy old man she just screamed at was about to deliver a fatal blow to her entire existence. I stood perfectly still, waiting for her to understand the absolute magnitude of the mistake she had made. I stood in the dead center of the courtroom, keeping my eyes locked on my daughter-in-law. Khloe was frozen, her mouth slightly open, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence. She looked around the room, searching for someone to rescue her from the corner she had just painted herself into. She looked at her husband, but Kendrick was staring at the floor, his spirit completely broken. She looked at her slick defense attorney, but he was busy packing his legal pads into his briefcase, preparing to flee. I reached my hand back toward the defense table without breaking eye contact with Khloe. Reuben, my brilliant lawyer, knew exactly what I needed. He opened his heavy black leather briefcase and pulled out a pristine manila folder. He placed it firmly into my outstretched hand. The folder felt heavy. It carried the weight of 40 years of blood, sweat, and tears. It carried the legacy of my late wife, Vivian. I held the folder up so the courtroom could see it. The fluorescent lights overhead caught the thick premium paper. I told Khloe that she loved to brag about her elite luxury pet spa. I told her that she loved to stand in front of her country club friends and boast about her prime retail location in the wealthiest downtown commercial district. I reminded her how she constantly looked down her nose at my worn-out work boots and my calloused hands, believing that my working-class background made me an inferior human being. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to her table. I told her that people who build their lives on vanity always forget to check the foundation. I opened the manila folder and pulled out a certified stack of commercial real estate documents. I held up the primary deed for the entire commercial block where her business operated. I read the name of the holding company out loud for the public record. I said the words L&V Holdings Incorporated. I asked Khloe if she had ever bothered to figure out what those letters stood for when she signed her commercial lease 3 years ago. I watched her swallow hard, her throat clicking in the quiet room. She shook her head slightly, a tiny involuntary movement of pure dread. I let a cold, unforgiving smile touch the corners of my mouth. I told her that the L stood for Leroy. I told her that the V stood for Vivian, the woman whose memory she had disrespected by trying to steal from her family. I told Khloe that 25 years ago, when she was still a child, I took the profits from crawling through those dirty ventilation shafts, and I bought the dirt beneath her feet. I purchased the brick, the mortar, and the entire commercial block in cash. I looked her dead in the eyes and delivered the absolute truth. I told her that I owned her building. I told her that she was not a self-made elite entrepreneur. I told her that she was simply my tenant and I was her landlord. The color vanished from Khloe's face entirely. Her arrogant posture crumbled. She gripped the edge of the petitioner's table to keep her balance, but her legs were visibly shaking. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as the reality of my words crashed into her fragile ego. But I was not finished dismantling her fake empire. I turned to the second page in my folder. It was the internal accounting ledger from my property management firm. I read the numbers aloud, making sure the court reporter captured every single syllable. I announced that the luxury pet spa was exactly 90 days delinquent on its commercial lease payments. I told the courtroom that Khloe was completely broke. I explained that she was drowning in debt because she spent all her business revenue on designer handbags and expensive dinners to impress people who did not actually care about her. I told her that my property management firm had sent her multiple default notices over the last 3 months, but she ignored them because she thought she could steal my trust fund to cover her failures. I took another step forward, projecting my voice with absolute authority. I told her that because she was 3 months behind on rent, I had officially executed my landlord rights. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the anticipation to suffocate her. I informed her that at exactly 8:00 this morning, while she was sitting in this courtroom crying fake crocodile tears to the judge, a team of private movers and a commercial locksmith arrived at her precious downtown business. I told her that the locks were already changed. I painted a vivid picture for her so she could see the destruction of her pride. I told her that her organic dog treats, her expensive display cases, her grooming tables, and her imported crystal chandeliers were currently sitting in cardboard boxes on the dirty public sidewalk. I told her that her elite country club friends were probably driving past her ruined business right now, taking pictures of her failure. I told her that her business was gone, and she was officially evicted. The reality of the situation hit Khloe like a physical blow. The absolute destruction of her identity, her wealth, and her social status crushed her all at once. She let out a guttural, agonizing scream that echoed off the high courtroom walls. It was not a fake, performative sob for the judge. It was a raw, visceral shriek of pure devastation. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed, hitting the polished wooden floor hard. She fell to her knees, clutching her stomach, crying hysterically. She scrambled on the ground, destroying her carefully crafted image of a wealthy, sophisticated woman. She tore at her hair, her face red and blotchy with frantic tears. She looked exactly like what she truly was, a desperate broke fraud who had just been evicted from the only thing that gave her value. The bailiff stepped forward, his hand on his radio, but Judge Davis held up a hand, signaling him to wait. The judge watched the scene unfold with cold satisfaction, allowing the consequences of Khloe's cruelty to play out in full view of the court. Kendrick, who had been frozen in terror, finally snapped out of his paralysis. He dropped to the floor next to his weeping wife. He looked up at me from his knees. His eyes were wide with panic, and his face was covered in a cold sweat. The arrogant son who had mocked me and tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward was now begging at my feet. He reached his hands out toward me, his voice cracking as he pleaded for mercy. He called me Dad over and over again, hoping to spark some lingering paternal instinct. He begged me to stop the eviction and call the movers off. He swore that they were just desperate and that they never really meant to hurt me. He cried that he was going to lose his mansion, his luxury cars, and his freedom because of the forged life insurance documents. He promised that he would do anything to make it right if I just called the property management firm and gave them the business back. He groveled on the courtroom floor, shedding pathetic tears in front of the judge, the bailiff, and his slick attorney, who was already walking toward the exit. I stood tall above them, looking down at the two people who had plotted to erase my existence. I looked at the son I had sacrificed my youth to protect. I looked at the woman who had weaponized my race and age against me. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt the deep, profound peace of a man who had successfully excised a toxic infection from his life. The surgery was brutal, but the patient was going to survive and thrive. I looked at my son kneeling on the ground with his crying wife holding onto his arm like a drowning sailor. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, chilling finality that cut through their frantic sobbing. I reminded Kendrick of my 70th birthday party. I reminded him of the dark corner of his dining room and the silver metal bowl he slid across the marble table in front of 20 laughing guests. I reminded him how he stood tall in his expensive tailored suit, puffing his chest out to impress a room full of strangers. I told him he had looked me in the eye and proudly stated that organic kibble was what freeloaders eat. I let the words hang in the heavy air of the courtroom, letting the memory burn into his mind. I told my son that it turns out I was never the freeloader. I pointed down at him and his wife sobbing helplessly on the floor. I told him that he was the parasite. I told him that he was the one surviving on my hard work and my silent charity for his entire adult life. I turned my back on them, adjusting my custom-tailored Italian wool suit jacket. I looked over my shoulder one last time, looking down at the wreckage of their fake lives. I delivered the final blow with absolute precision. I told my son to enjoy the dog food. The sound of the heavy wooden gavel striking the sounding block echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Judge Davis brought the heavy mallet down a second time, demanding absolute silence in her court. The sharp crack cut through the pathetic sobbing of my daughter-in-law and the frantic begging of my son. Kendrick froze on his knees, his hands still reaching out toward me. Khloe choked on her own tears, covering her mouth as she looked up at the high bench. Judge Davis stood up slightly, leaning over the polished mahogany desk. Her eyes were blazing with a righteous fury that I had rarely seen in my 75 years of life. She pointed her wooden gavel directly at Kendrick and ordered him to get off the floor and sit in his chair immediately. She told him that his display was a disgrace to the courtroom and a disgrace to his father. Kendrick scrambled backward, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the polished floor, and collapsed into his seat. The judge turned her attention to the thick stack of documents resting in front of her. She adjusted her glasses and took a deep breath to steady her anger. She stated for the official public record that she had presided over family court for more than 20 years. She told the room that she had seen greedy relatives fight over inheritances, and she had seen broken families argue over care plans. But she stated clearly that she had never in her entire career witnessed a more malicious, calculated, and predatory conspiracy than the one presented by the petitioner today. She looked at Kendrick's slick attorney, who was staring at his notepad, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. She informed the attorney that he was incredibly lucky she was not holding him in direct contempt of court, but she assured him that she would be forwarding his name to the State Bar Association for submitting a fraudulent medical certificate. Judge Davis then formally addressed the emergency petition for conservatorship. She stated that the medical evidence provided by my legal counsel was overwhelming and completely undeniable. She declared that I was in peak cognitive health and that my financial decisions were not only rational but incredibly prudent given the parasitic nature of the people feeding off my estate. She ruled that the psychiatric evaluation purchased from Dr. Arthur Vance was a blatant fabrication. With a swift stroke of her pen, she dismissed the emergency petition for guardianship. But she did not just dismiss it. She announced that the case was dismissed with prejudice. That meant Kendrick and Khloe could never again attempt to file this lawsuit against me. The legal door was permanently welded shut. They had completely lost their battle to steal my trust fund and my freedom. But the end of the civil case was only the beginning of their nightmare. Judge Davis placed the family court file to the side and picked up the clear plastic folder that Ruben had handed her. It contained the life insurance loan application with my forged signature and the high-resolution photographs of Kendrick handing a cash bribe to the disgraced doctor. The judge's voice dropped an octave, growing cold and utterly dangerous. She informed my son that family court was a civil venue designed to handle domestic disputes. However, she stated that when a petitioner submits forged banking documents and engages in the bribery of a medical professional, the venue immediately shifts. She told Kendrick that elder financial abuse, identity theft, and federal bank fraud were severe criminal offenses that carried mandatory prison sentences. Kendrick began to shake violently. He shook his head back and forth, whispering pleas to the judge. He tried to say he was just desperate and that he never meant to hurt anyone. But Judge Davis was entirely unmoved by his late apologies. She looked over the bench toward the two armed bailiffs standing near the heavy wooden doors. She gave them a single firm nod. She ordered the bailiffs to detain the petitioner immediately on suspicion of forgery and elder financial exploitation, pending a full criminal investigation by the district attorney and federal banking authorities. The two large officers moved with practiced speed. They marched down the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. Kendrick panicked. He pushed his chair back, trying to stand up, but his legs were trembling too much to support his weight. One bailiff grabbed his left arm and twisted it firmly behind his back. The second bailiff grabbed his right arm, doing the same. The cold, sharp click of metal handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed through the silent courtroom. It was the most definitive sound of justice I had ever heard. My son, the man who wore tailored suits and drove imported sports cars, was now physically restrained like a common street criminal. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as the reality of a federal prison sentence crashed down on his shoulders. He looked over his shoulder at his wife. He called out Khloe's name. He begged her to call a criminal defense lawyer. He begged her to help him. Khloe was pressed against the wooden barrier of the gallery separating the seating area from the court tables. She stared at her husband in handcuffs. The woman who had spent the last 3 years bragging about her elite status and her self-made luxury pet spa was now staring at a man who had absolutely nothing left to offer her. Her business was gone. The locks were changed and her inventory was on the sidewalk. Her $1.5 million mansion was going into foreclosure because the mortgage was not paid. Her credit cards were frozen and maxed out. And now her husband was a detained felon. She looked at Kendrick and she did not see a partner. She saw a sinking ship. Khloe did not offer him a word of comfort. She did not promise to call a lawyer. She did not shed a single tear for the man she had conspired with. She looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated self-preservation. She grabbed her expensive designer handbag off the wooden bench. She turned her back on her crying, handcuffed husband, and she ran. She literally sprinted down the center aisle of the courtroom, pushing the heavy wooden doors open and disappearing into the hallway. She abandoned him in the blink of an eye, trying to save her own skin and escape the fallout of their ruined empire. Kendrick watched the doors swing shut behind his wife. He let out a pathetic, broken sob. He was completely alone. Ruben calmly closed his heavy black leather briefcases, clicking the brass locks into place. He looked at me and gave a small, satisfied nod. We had executed the strategy flawlessly. I stood up from the defense table and buttoned my charcoal gray suit jacket. I did not look at my son as the bailiffs read him his rights and forced him to walk toward the holding cells at the back of the courtroom. I did not have a single word left to say to him. I had given him 42 years of my life, and he had thrown it all away for vanity and greed. I walked down the center aisle, my posture straight, my head held high, and pushed open the heavy wooden doors. I walked through the bustling hallways of the courthouse, leaving the chaos and the crying far behind me. I stepped out through the main glass doors and out onto the wide concrete steps. The morning air was incredibly fresh. It smelled like rain and new beginnings. I took a deep, slow breath, filling my lungs with the cold, crisp air. I looked down at the street level where a marked police cruiser was parked with its lights flashing. I watched from the top of the stairs as the bailiffs shoved my son into the back of the police car. Kendrick ducked his head to avoid hitting the doorframe, his hands bound securely behind his back. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing him inside the metal cage. I stood there on the steps of the courthouse and watched the police cruiser pull away from the curb, merging into the busy city traffic. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no regret. I felt no sorrow for the man sitting in the back of that car. He had dug his own grave and he had jumped inside it willingly. I had spent my entire life building a legacy to protect my family, but when the family became the threat, I knew exactly how to dismantle them. The silent adjustment was completely finished. I turned around, walked down the steps, and hailed a taxi to take me back to my hotel. My 75th year on this earth was going to be my best one yet. The sun is setting over the water, casting a deep red glow across the surface of the lake. I am sitting in a custom-built cedar rocking chair on the wraparound porch of my new home. I am 75 years old today. 5 full years have passed since the night I walked out of that cold, dark basement and left a house full of arrogant strangers behind. Today, the only sounds I hear are the gentle lapping of the water against my private dock and the crackle of a massive fire pit burning in the backyard. I bought this property in cash. I hold the deed in my own name. There are no silent co-signers, and there are absolutely no freeloaders living under my roof. I finally found the peace that my wife Vivian and I worked so hard to build. People always ask me what happened to my son after the courtroom doors closed. They want to know if I ever felt sorry for him when the heavy metal handcuffs went on. The truth is, I did not shed a single tear for the man he chose to become. Kendrick did not go to federal prison. His slick lawyer abandoned him, but a public defender managed to negotiate a plea deal with the district attorney. My son pleaded guilty to felony forgery and elder financial abuse. He received 3 years of strict probation and a permanent criminal record that destroyed his fake consulting career overnight. The bank foreclosed on the $1.5 million mansion a month after the trial. The luxury cars were repossessed. Today, the boy who once fed me dog food and bragged about his elite status wears a faded uniform. He works as a night shift delivery driver, dropping off fast food to the very same wealthy neighborhoods he used to pretend he owned. He drives a beat-up sedan and struggles to pay rent for a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of the city. He has tried to call me a few times over the years, leaving desperate voicemails asking for forgiveness. I never answer. I delete the messages before he even finishes speaking. And then there is Khloe, the woman who weaponized my race and my age, who marched into my old neighborhood trying to paint me as a crazy old black man. Her downfall was spectacular and swift. The morning of the court hearing, my property management firm legally changed the locks on her luxury pet spa. All of her expensive organic dog treats and imported crystal chandeliers were boxed up and dumped on the public sidewalk for everyone to see. Without my silent financial backing, her entire business went completely bankrupt in a matter of weeks. She could not handle the poverty. She could not handle being married to a disgraced, convicted felon. The moment the money dried up, Khloe filed for divorce and ran away, trying to save her own image. I heard from my lawyer Ruben that she now works as an assistant groomer at a discount pet store scrubbing mud off stray dogs for minimum wage. The elite country club friends she tried so hard to impress do not even acknowledge her existence anymore. She lost her fake empire because she tried to steal mine. I take a deep breath of the crisp evening air. A loud burst of laughter erupts from the backyard, bringing my attention back to the present moment. I stand up from my rocking chair and walk toward the back patio. The scene in front of me is the exact opposite of that miserable 70th birthday party. There are no fake corporate executives in tailored suits. There are no arrogant women holding poodles. Instead, the yard is filled with people who actually matter. My loyal niece Aisha is standing by the fire pit laughing loudly. Aisha was the only person in my entire extended family who called me to make sure I was safe when the rumors started flying. She saw right through Khloe's lies and stood by my side during the trial. Now I am paying for her medical school tuition in full, and I could not be prouder of the woman she is becoming. Sitting around the massive wooden picnic table are 5 of my oldest friends. They are the same men who crawled through the dirt and hauled heavy equipment with me back when Marcus & Sons heating and cooling was just a single rusty truck. We have gray hair and bad knees now, but our minds are as sharp as ever. We are not eating dry organic kibble tonight. The massive outdoor grill is loaded with the most expensive cuts of dry aged steak money can buy. The smell of seasoned meat and rich wood smoke fills the air. We are drinking aged bourbon and telling stories about the days when a handshake actually meant something. This is what real wealth looks like. It is not about designer clothes or gated communities. It is about surrounding yourself with people who respect you for the calluses on your hands and the strength of your character. I walk down the wooden steps and join my family and my friends. I take a plate of hot, perfectly cooked steak and sit at the head of the table. I look around at the smiles and listen to the genuine joy echoing across the water. I think about the journey that brought me here to this exact moment. I learned the hard way that you cannot buy loyalty and you cannot finance love. Some people will drain your life completely dry and then mock you for having nothing left. But I also learned that true power does not require screaming or throwing tantrums. True power is quiet. True power is waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I look right forward with absolute clarity. You do not have to bark back at a dog that bites you. You just buy the house it lives in and evict it. Stay sharp and never let them mistake your silence for weakness. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional financial support. When you spend your life building a safety net for your children, you sometimes accidentally build a hammock that paralyzes their ambition. Family is not determined simply by sharing a bloodline. Real family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, gratitude, and genuine care for one another. You cannot buy loyalty, and you cannot pay someone to treat you with basic human dignity. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is step back and let their grown children face the brutal consequences of their own decisions. If you found value in my story, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments how you would handle ungrateful relatives in your own life.